Welcome, and thank you for joining me for our story tonight. Let's travel back in time, shall we? Settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift to a world that seems both distant and strangely familiar. Our story begins on a calm night in the year 1860. Imagine the sounds of this America. In the sprawling cities of the North, like New York or Boston, the evening air might carry the distant clang of a factory bell marking the end of a long shift. Horse-drawn carriages clatter over cobblestone streets, their lanterns casting dancing shadows on brick buildings. The low murmur of conversation spills from gaslit taverns and parlors, where people discuss the day's news, their voices a mixture of excitement and concern. Out on the vast, rolling prairies of the West, the world is much quieter. Here, the night is dominated by the gentle whisper of the wind through tall grasses and the lonely cry of a coyote under a vast, stardusted sky. Families in their sod houses or simple log cabins are settling down, the flicker of a single candle or the warm glow of a hearth fire pushing back the immense darkness. And in the south, on sprawling plantations and small farms, the air is thick and warm, heavy with the scent of magnolia and jasmine. The rhythmic chirp of crickets and cicadas forms a steady, hypnotic chorus, a natural lullaby for a land on the edge of a dream, or perhaps a nightmare. This was a nation of 31.5 million souls, a vibrant and expanding country, yet one that was deeply, fundamentally divided. It was like a family living under one roof, but speaking to different languages, dreaming to different dreams. The America of 1860 was really two Americas. In the North, society was a whirlwind of progress and change. Industry was king. Factories churned out textiles, iron, and machinery. Railroads were stretching their iron tentacles across the landscape, connecting cities and carrying goods and people faster than ever before. This was a world driven by wages, by commerce, by the belief that hard work and ingenuity could lead to prosperity. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and beyond poured into the northern ports, seeking a new life and adding their own unique threads to the nation's fabric. Education was expanding, and new ideas about society, philosophy, and human rights were debated with fervor in lecture halls and newspapers. There was a palpable sense of momentum, a belief in a future that was being built day by day. But travel south, and the picture changes dramatically. The southern economy was not built on factories, but on the land. Vast fields of cotton, tobacco, and sugar cane stretched to the horizon. King Cotton, they called it, and it was a powerful monarch indeed. Its reign built entirely on the forced labor of nearly 4 million enslaved African Americans. Life here moved at a different pace, dictated by the seasons and the rhythms of agriculture. The social structure was rigid, a hierarchy with a small, wealthy planter class at the top. Honor, tradition, and a fierce sense of independence were the guiding principles. While the North looked forward, embracing the new, the South often looked back, cherishing a vision of a pastoral agrarian society and defending it with every fiber of its being. These two Americas were bound together by a shared history, a single flag, and a common government. But the fault line between them was growing wider and deeper with each passing day. The central, agonizing question was slavery. To the North, it was increasingly seen as a moral stain, an archaic and brutal institution that contradicted the nation's founding principles of liberty and equality. A vocal and passionate abolitionist movement was gaining strength, demanding an end to what they called a national sin. To the South, slavery was not just an economic necessity. It was woven into the very fabric of their society, their culture, and their identity. They saw the abolitionist cries from the North not just as a threat to their livelihood, but as an attack on their way of life, their honor, and their rights. So, on this calm night in 1860, as people went to sleep, what were they dreaming of? A factory worker in Philadelphia might dream of a promotion, of saving enough money to buy a small home for his family. A pioneer family in Kansas might dream of a successful harvest, of turning their patch of wilderness into a prosperous farm. A wealthy planter in South Carolina might dream of a bumper cotton crop and rising prices, secure in his world. And what of the enslaved man or woman in a cabin in Mississippi? Their dreams were likely of freedom, a desperate, secret dream of a life where their bodies, their labor, and their families were their own. This was a year of great anticipation and anxiety, because it was a presidential election year. The nation was holding its breath. The political parties were fracturing along regional lines, unable to bridge the gap between North and South. The candidates represented not just different policies, but entirely different visions for the country's soul. In the parlors of Boston, the saloons of Chicago, and on the porches of Charleston, the talk was of politics, of secession, of war. The words were often whispered, as if saying them too loudly might make the unthinkable real. The man who would soon emerge at the center of this storm was a lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. To many in the North, he represented hope, a moderate, thoughtful leader who believed the nation could not continue as a house divided against itself. But to the South, his name was a symbol of everything they feared. His opposition to the expansion of slavery was seen as a direct threat to their entire social and economic order. His likely election, they vowed, would be the final straw. Yet, for this one night, let us imagine the calm. Before the storm broke, before the cannons roared, before the nation would tear itself apart in the most tragic chapter of its history. On this night in 1860, a farmer checks on his livestock. A mother sings a lullaby to her child. A ship captain gazes at the stars from the deck of his vessel. They are all Americans, living their lives under the same wide sky. They are filled with the ordinary hopes and fears that people have always had. They are blissfully, or perhaps willfully, unaware that they are standing on the precipice of a cataclysm. Their calm, peaceful night is the deep, quiet breath before the plunge. The world they know, the very definition of their country, is about to change forever. The quiet of 1860 was a fragile thing, a thin veneer of peace stretched out over a chasm of irreconcilable differences. And as the sun would rise on the days and weeks to come, that veneer would begin to tear, revealing the bitter conflict that had been brewing for decades just beneath the surface of American life. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. I hope you found this quiet glimpse into a pivotal moment in history relaxing and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more chapters from our shared past. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams be peaceful. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we redive in deep into the early years of a man who would one day change the course of American history. Abraham Lincoln. But before the presidency, before the debates, before he was a household name, he was just a boy growing up on the rugged American frontier. Let's journey back to where it all began. Our story starts on February 12, 1809, inside a one-room log cabin on the sinking spring farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky. This wasn't just any cabin. It was tiny, with a packed earth floor and a single window. Imagine a space smaller than a modern-day living room, housing a whole family. This was the world Abraham Lincoln was born into. His parents, Thomas and Nancy Hanks Lincoln, were hard-working but poor farmers. They weren't famous or wealthy. They were pioneers, carving out a life from the wilderness. Life on the frontier was tough. It was a constant battle against the elements, a struggle for survival. Young Abe learned this from his earliest days. His chores weren't just about making his bed. They were about helping the family survive. He would have helped fetch water, gather firewood, and tend to the small crops they grew. This wasn't a world of comfort. It was a world of relentless hard work. It instilled in him a deep understanding of labor and the value of every single thing they had. When Abe was just 2 years old, the family moved a few miles away to Knob Creek Farm. This is where he had his first real memories. He recalled one day, while playing near the creek, he fell in and was saved by a neighbor's son. It's a small anecdote, but it paints a picture of a childhood spent outdoors, surrounded by nature and its inherent dangers. His formal schooling during this time was almost non-existent. He attended what were called blab schools, where students would recite their lessons out loud all at once. It was chaotic, and he only attended for a few weeks here and there. The biggest upheaval of his young life came in 1816, when he was 7. His family packed up everything they owned and moved north, across the Ohio River, into Indiana. The reason for the move was complex, partly due to land title disputes in Kentucky, but a major factor was slavery. Kentucky was a slave state, and Thomas Lincoln, a devout Baptist, was staunchly against it. He wanted to raise his children in a free territory. This journey itself was an epic undertaking, hacking a path through dense forests to reach their new home in Perry County, now Spencer County, Indiana. Their new life in Indiana was even more challenging. They arrived in a wilderness, an unbroken forest. Their first winter was spent in a crude, three-sided shelter, with one side open to a roaring fire for warmth and cooking. Can you imagine that? A 7-year-old boy spending a harsh Indiana winter in a makeshift lean-to. It was here that Abe truly learned the meaning of resilience. He and his father had to clear the land, tree by tree, just to plant a small crop of corn and vegetables. Abe, with a small axe in hand, became skilled at felling trees. This physical labor built up his famously strong and lanky frame. Tragedy struck the family in 1818. A disease called milk sickness swept through their small community. It was caused by drinking the milk of cows that had eaten the poisonous white snakeroot plant. Abe's mother, Nancy, contracted the illness and died. Abe was only 9 years old. This loss was devastating. He later described the sorrow as something that shadowed him for the rest of his life. He had to help his father build his own mother's coffin. This profound grief at such a young age undoubtedly deepened his character, giving him a sense of empathy and a melancholy that would be a hallmark of his personality. For about a year, the household was in disarray. Abe's older sister, Sarah, who was only 11, took over the cooking and cleaning, trying her best to care for her brother and father. The cabin was a lonely place, but Thomas Lincoln knew his children needed a mother. In 1819, he traveled back to Kentucky and returned with a new wife, a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston. She was a kind and compassionate woman who brought her own 3 children into the family. The arrival of Sarah Bush Johnston was a turning point for young Abe. She treated Abe and his sister as her own, bringing warmth, order, and love back into the log cabin. She also brought books. While his own mother had taught him his letters, it was his stepmother who truly nurtured his love for learning. She saw the spark of intelligence in him and encouraged it at every turn. The family was still poor, but the home was now a place of stability and encouragement. And oh, how Abe loved to read. In a world where books were a rare and precious commodity, he devoured every single one he could get his hands on. The family owned a Bible, which he read and reread until he knew long passages by heart. He would walk for miles just to borrow a book from a neighbor. He read The Pilgrim's Progress, Robinson Crusoe, and Parson Weems's Life of Washington. He would read late into the night by the light of the fireplace, often scribbling notes and practicing his writing on a wooden shovel with a piece of charcoal because paper was too expensive. This self-education was the foundation of his future greatness. His total formal schooling amounted to less than a year, but his informal education was constant. He wasn't just reading for pleasure. He was learning. He was studying grammar, mathematics, and history on his own. He developed a unique writing and speaking style, characterized by its clarity, logic, and simplicity. He learned how to build an argument, how to persuade, and how to connect with people through words. This skill, honed in the dim light of a log cabin, would one day move a nation. As he grew into a teenager, he was known for his physical strength and his height. He was already over 6 feet tall and could out-wrestle and outwork most men in the area. He worked as a farmhand, a rail splitter, and even operated a ferry, taking passengers across the Anderson River. These jobs brought him into contact with all sorts of people, merchants and politicians, broadening his understanding of the world beyond his small frontier community. He was also known for his honesty, earning the nickname Honest Abe long before he entered politics, and for his sense of humor and love of storytelling. He would often entertain his friends and co-workers with funny stories and jokes, a trait that made him popular and well-liked. In 1828, at the age of 19, an opportunity arose that would change his perspective forever. A local merchant hired Abe to help take a flatboat full of farm produce down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. This was his first real glimpse of the wider world. The journey was an adventure, fraught with dangers like river pirates and treacherous currents. But it was in New Orleans that he came face to face with the brutal reality of slavery on a massive scale. He witnessed a slave auction, seeing families torn apart and human beings sold like livestock. The sight reportedly sickened him and left a lasting impression. This experience solidified the anti-slavery convictions he had inherited from his father, hardening his resolve against the institution. In 1830, when Lincoln was 21, The family moved once again, this time to Illinois. After helping his father establish a new farm, Abe decided it was time to strike out on his own. He had spent his entire life in the wilderness, shaped by hardship, labor, loss, and a relentless pursuit of knowledge. His humble beginnings were not a disadvantage. They were his crucible. The frontier taught him resilience, patience, and perseverance. His poverty taught him humility and empathy for the common person. The backbreaking labor gave him physical and mental toughness. The loss of his mother gave him a profound depth of feeling, and his self-driven education gave him the intellectual tools to articulate his vision for a better nation. Every splinter from splitting rails, every page read by firelight, every mile walked to borrow a book, forged the character of the man who would be called upon to save the Union. His early life was the bedrock upon which his entire career was built. He was not born into greatness. He earned it. He rose from the dirt floor of a log cabin to the highest office in the land, not in spite of his humble origins, but because of them. They gave him an unshakable connection to the American people and a deep, abiding faith in the promise of the nation. Thank you so much for joining me today to explore the formative years of Abraham Lincoln. It's a powerful reminder that greatness can come from the most unlikely of places. In our next chapter, we'll follow Abe as he leaves the farm behind and begins his journey into law and politics in New Salem. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. See you next time. Have you ever wondered what it takes to go from a humble background to the highest office in the land? Let's dive into the fascinating early years of one of history's most iconic figures, Abraham Lincoln, long before he was president. Our story begins in 1830, when a 21-year-old Lincoln, tall and lanky, moves with his family from Indiana to Illinois. This wasn't just a change of scenery. It was the start of his journey toward independence and self-discovery. Imagine the American frontier in the 1830s. It was a rugged, demanding place. Lincoln, known for his incredible physical strength, was right at home. He quickly earned a reputation as a formidable rail splitter. Wielding a heavy axe, he could split hundreds of logs a day to build fences. This backbreaking work not only built his muscles but also solidified his image as a man of the people, a symbol of hard work and frontier grit that would later become a powerful part of his political identity. But Abe was more than just muscle. His mind was always working, always hungry for more. After helping his family get settled, Lincoln struck out on his own. He landed in the small, bustling village of New Salem, Illinois. This place would become the crucible where his character and ambitions were forged. His first real job was as a clerk in a general store. Now, this might sound mundane, but for Lincoln, it was like a university. The store was the social hub of the town. People from all walks of life came in to trade goods, share news, and tell stories, and Lincoln was right in the middle of it all. He wasn't just selling cloth and weighing sugar. He was listening, observing, and connecting with people. He learned about their hopes, their struggles, and their opinions on everything from local politics to the price of crops. This daily interaction was his first real education in human nature and public sentiment. It was here that he honed his legendary storytelling skills. Lincoln had a gift for humor and a knack for finding the perfect anecdote to make a point or lighten a mood. People would gather around just to hear him spin a yarn. These weren't just jokes. They were lessons in wit, wisdom, and persuasion that he would later use to great effect in law and politics. His honesty also became legendary. The story of Honest Abe walking miles to return a few cents to a customer who had been overcharged wasn't just a myth. It was rooted in his time as a New Salem clerk. This integrity earned him the deep trust and respect of his community, which would be crucial for his future endeavors. He was a man you could count on, whether it was to fairly measure a yard of fabric or to lead the nation. But working in the store wasn't his only gig. Life on the frontier required versatility. When the story worked, that eventually fell to common fate for many small businesses back then. Lincoln didn't sit around feeling sorry for himself. He took on whatever work he could find. He served as the local postmaster, which was another fantastic opportunity for him. The post office gave him access to newspapers from all over the country. In an age without internet or television, newspapers were the primary source of information. He would read every single one that came through his office, cover to cover. This kept him informed about national debates, political figures, and the pressing issues of the day, like slavery and economic policy. He was essentially giving himself a world-class political education, one newspaper at a time. Alongside his work, Lincoln's ambition began to take a more definite shape. He developed a burning interest in law. He saw law not just as a profession, but as a framework for justice and order in a chaotic frontier society. He was fascinated by logic, reason, and the art of constructing a compelling argument. But how could a poor young man with barely a year of formal schooling become a lawyer? He did it the Lincoln way, through relentless self-education. He would borrow law books from a local justice of the peace, John Bowling, and a lawyer named John T. Stewart. He studied tirelessly, often reading by firelight late into the night after a long day of physical labor. He would recite legal principles and cases out loud, while walking down the road or splitting rails. To his neighbors, he might have seemed a bit eccentric, but they also saw a young man with incredible determination. He was teaching himself to think like a lawyer, to analyze problems, and to build a case from the ground up. This was the foundation of the brilliant legal mind that would later draft some of the most important documents in American history. It was also during his time in New Salem that Lincoln first dipped his toes into politics. Encouraged by his neighbors who admired his intelligence and honesty, he ran for the Illinois state legislature in 1832. He was only 23 years old. He campaigned on a platform of improving infrastructure, like the local Sangamon River, to help the community prosper. Although he lost that first election, the only one he ever lost by a direct vote of the people, it was an invaluable experience. He learned how to give a speech, how to connect with voters, and how to articulate a vision for the future. He didn't give up. He ran again in 1834 and won, beginning a political career that would eventually lead him to the White House. But it all started here, in the small towns and prairies of Illinois. The young man who arrived as a simple laborer was slowly but surely transforming himself. He was a rail splitter, a store clerk, a postmaster, a storyteller, and a self-taught student of law. Each role added a new layer to his character and a new skill to his arsenal. These years on the Illinois frontier were absolutely critical. They shaped Lincoln into the man he would become. He learned the value of hard work, the importance of integrity, the power of a good story, and the necessity of education. He connected with everyday people and understood their lives in a way that few leaders ever have. He wasn't born into privilege. He built himself, piece by piece, through curiosity, ambition, and an unshakable belief in his own potential. The seeds of greatness were planted not in a grand university or a wealthy estate, but in the rich soil of the American frontier. So, the next time you think of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator and savior of the Union, remember the young man in Illinois. Picture him splitting rails, telling stories in a country store, and reading law books by the dim glow of a fire. It was there, in those humble beginnings, that the journey truly began. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into Lincoln's early life as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical figures you'd like to learn about. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our series, where we're journeying through the incredible life of Abraham Lincoln. Today in Chapter 4, we re-dive into one of the most pivotal transformations of his life. His journey to becoming a self-taught lawyer. This wasn't just a career change. It was the forging of the man who would one day lead a nation. So, how does a young man from the frontier, with barely a year of formal schooling, become a respected attorney? For Lincoln, the answer was simple: relentless determination and a pile of books. After his brief and somewhat chaotic time in the Black Hawk War, and a failed attempt at running a general store, Lincoln found himself at a crossroads. He was the postmaster of New Salem, a job that gave him access to newspapers and correspondence, but more importantly, it gave him time. Time to read, and time to think. It was during this period that Lincoln's interest in law truly ignited. Legend has it that he stumbled upon a copy of Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England in a barrel of old goods he had purchased. For most people, this would have been a dense, unreadable text. For Lincoln, it was a key unlocking a new world. He devoured it. He'd lie under a tree, his long legs propped up, completely lost in the intricate principles of common law. He would read while walking, read while waiting for customers at the post office. He read every chance he got. His study method was unconventional, to say the least. He had no professor, no classroom, no study group. His university was the quiet corners of New Salem, and his teachers were the authors of the books he could borrow. He would often walk miles to borrow a law book from John T. Stewart, an established lawyer in Springfield who saw potential in the earnest young man. Lincoln would read the book, return it, and walk back with another. This wasn't just about memorizing statutes. Lincoln had a unique ability to grasp the fundamental principles of justice and logic that underpinned the law. He wasn't just learning rules. He was learning how to think, or to reason, and how to construct a logical argument from the ground up. This self-directed education honed his mind in a way that a formal schooling might not have. It forced him to wrestle with complex ideas on his own, to break them down until he understood them in his very bones. In 1836, after years of this intense, solitary study, Abraham Lincoln received his law license. He was 27 years old. He packed his few belongings into a pair of saddlebags, borrowed a horse, and rode to Springfield, the new state capital of Illinois, to begin his career. He arrived with almost no money, but he had something far more valuable: a sharp mind, a growing reputation for integrity, and an unshakable work ethic. His first partnership was with John T. Stewart, the very man who had loaned him those crucial law books. Later, he would partner with Stephen T. Logan, and finally, with the younger William Herndon, a partnership that would last until Lincoln's death. As a lawyer, Lincoln wasn't flashy. He didn't rely on dramatic theatrical courtroom performances. Instead, his power lay in his clarity, his logic, and his profound sense of fairness. He was known for his ability to explain complex legal issues in simple, everyday language that any juror could understand. He often used stories and homespun analogies, drawn from his own frontier experiences, to make his points relatable and memorable. One of the defining characteristics of Lincoln's legal career was his unwavering honesty. He quickly earned the nickname Honest Abe, and it wasn't just a folksy saying. It was a reputation he earned case by case. He famously advised a client, "We can doubtless gain your case for you. We can set a whole neighborhood alook. We can distress a widowed mother and her 6 fatherless children, and thereby get you $600 to which you seem to have a legal claim, but which rightfully belongs. It appears to me to the old woman and her children. Some things that are legally right are not morally right. We shall not take your case, but will give you a little advice for which we will charge you nothing. You seem to be a sprightly, energetic man. We would advise you to try your hand at making $600 in some other way." He believed his duty was not just to win, but to see that justice was done. He would sometimes refuse cases if he believed his potential client was in the wrong. In court, he was known for being exceptionally fair to his opponents, sometimes even conceding points if he knew the other side was correct. This wasn't a weakness. It was his greatest strength. Juries and judges came to trust him implicitly. They knew that when Lincoln argued a point, he genuinely believed in it. Lincoln practiced as a circuit lawyer, which meant he spent about half the year traveling on horseback or in a buggy across the 8th Judicial Circuit of Illinois. This circuit covered a vast area of the state, and life on the road was tough. He and other lawyers and judges would travel from county seat to county seat, staying in crowded taverns, often sharing beds. But this experience was invaluable. It kept him connected to the common people of Illinois. He heard their stories, their disputes, and their hopes. He wasn't an isolated city lawyer. He was part of the fabric of the community. During these long journeys, in the evenings at the taverns, Lincoln became known as a masterful storyteller. He would hold his colleagues captive with his wit, his humor, and his seemingly endless supply of anecdotes. This wasn't just for entertainment. It was how he built relationships, diffused tensions, and sharpened his communication skills. His cases were incredibly varied. One day he might be arguing a land dispute between 2 farmers, the next day defending someone accused of hog theft, and the day after that, representing a major railroad company. One of his most famous cases was the Almanac trial. His client, Duff Armstrong, was accused of murder, and the key witness claimed to have seen the crime clearly by the light of a bright, high moon. Lincoln, defending Armstrong, produced an almanac and demonstrated to the jury that on the night of the crime, the moon was barely a sliver and had already set. It wasn't a trick. It was meticulous preparation and a masterful use of evidence. He not only used facts, but also appealed to the jury's emotions, reminding them of his long friendship with the Armstrong family. Duff Armstrong was acquitted, and the story became legendary. A perfect example of Lincoln's blend of sharp legal reasoning and genuine human connection. Through these 2 decades as a lawyer, Lincoln refined the skills that would define his presidency. He learned the art of persuasion, not through force, but through reason and empathy. He mastered the ability to see both sides of an issue, to understand his opponent's argument, as well as his own. And most importantly, he solidified his core belief in justice, fairness, and the rule of law as the foundation of a free society. His legal career was a laboratory where he tested his ideas about human nature, government, and morality. It transformed him from a rough-hewn frontiersman into a sophisticated thinker and a formidable public figure. The honesty, logic, and empathy he cultivated as Honest Abe, the Illinois lawyer, were the very qualities a divided nation would desperately need in its darkest hour. Thanks for watching. Join us next time as we explore Chapter 5, where Lincoln's legal career and his deeply held principles on slavery propel him back onto the national political stage. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. See you then. Have you ever wondered how a self-taught backwoods lawyer became one of the most consequential presidents in American history? The story doesn't start in the White House. It starts much earlier, in the rough-and-tumble world of frontier politics. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln's entry into politics. By the early 1830s, Lincoln was a young man in his 20s, living in the small, newly formed village of New Salem, Illinois. He had tried his hand at a few things: a flatboat trip to New Orleans, clerking in a store, even a brief stint as a postmaster and surveyor. But a different kind of ambition was starting within him. He saw the rapid growth happening around him and wanted to be a part of shaping its future. In 1832, at the young age of 23, Lincoln decided to run for the Illinois state legislature. This was an audacious move for someone with no formal education, no money, and no powerful connections. His campaign was interrupted by the Black Hawk War, where he enlisted and was surprisingly elected captain of his volunteer company. He later joked that this was the only election he ever won by a direct vote of the people, and it gave him more satisfaction than any other. Though he lost that first election, he made a strong showing in his own district, which told him something important. People who knew him trusted him. He didn't give up. He spent the next 2 years studying law, improving his grammar, and building his reputation. He learned how to debate, how to connect with voters, and how to articulate. His vision for Illinois, a vision centered on internal improvements like building canals, roads, and railroads to connect the frontier state to the rest of the country. In 1834, Lincoln ran again. This time, he won. At just 25, he was on his way to the state capitol. Then invented. This marked the true beginning of his political journey. Life in the Illinois legislature was a master class in practical politics. It was a boisterous environment filled with ambitious men, intense debates, and backroom deals. Lincoln quickly proved to be a skilled operator. It was a Whig party that favored economic development and a strong central government, which perfectly aligned with his belief in progress. One of his most significant achievements during this period was his leading role in the effort to move the state capital from Vandalia to Springfield. This was a hugely contentious issue, with several towns vying for the honor. Lincoln, along with a group of other tall legislators from Sangamon County known as the Long Nine, used their collective political muscle, strategic log rolling, and persuasive arguments to secure the prize for Springfield in 1837. This was a major political victory that cemented his status as a rising star in Illinois politics. But it wasn't all about infrastructure and moving capitals. Lincoln was also beginning to form his views on the most divisive issue of the era: slavery. In 1837, in response to resolutions passed by the legislature that condemned abolitionism but also affirmed the evils of slavery, Lincoln and a fellow legislator, Don Stone, issued a formal protest. While carefully worded, their statement was remarkable for its time. It declared that they believed the institution of slavery is founded on both injustice and bad policy. It was one of the first times Lincoln publicly put his moral opposition to slavery on the record. It was a quiet act of conscience, but it was a signpost pointing toward the moral battles he would one day lead. Lincoln served a total of 4 terms in the Illinois House of Representatives from 1834 to 1842. During this time, he also became a lawyer, moving to Springfield and partnering with prominent attorneys. His legal and political careers were intertwined. His experiences in the legislature sharpened his mind, honed his skills in debate and negotiation, and expanded his network. He learned how to build coalitions, how to compromise when necessary, and when to stand firm on principle. After leaving the state legislature, Lincoln focused on his growing law practice, but his political ambition had not faded. He had his eyes set on a bigger stage. The United States Congress. The path to Washington was not easy. Within the Whig Party in his district, there was an informal agreement to rotate the congressional seat among its leading members. Lincoln had to wait his turn. His rivals, including his friends John J. Hardin and Edward D. Baker, both served a term before him. Finally, in 1846, it was Lincoln's turn. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and arrived in Washington, D.C. in December 1847. He was now a national lawmaker, but he was a very junior one. He was the lone Whig in the Illinois delegation, a small fish in a very large and turbulent pond. The defining issue of his single term in Congress was the Mexican-American War, which had begun in 1846 under Democratic President James K. Polk. While the war was popular with many Americans who were swept up in the spirit of manifest destiny, Lincoln, like many fellow Whigs, was deeply skeptical. He believed the war was an unnecessary and unconstitutional act of aggression, initiated by President Polk primarily to acquire new territory for the expansion of slavery. Lincoln decided to challenge the president directly. In a series of resolutions that came to be known as the Spot Resolutions, he demanded that Polk show the exact spot on American soil where American blood had first been shed, implying that the conflict had actually been instigated on Mexican territory. This was a bold and principled stand, but it was a political disaster back home. It was branded Spotty Lincoln by his opponents and accused of being His position was deeply unpopular in his district, which had sent many volunteers to fight in the war. The political fallout was severe. Lincoln had promised to serve only 1 term, but his stance on the war ensured he wouldn't have been re-elected anyway. His term in Congress was, by most accounts, unremarkable. Besides spot resolutions, he worked on typical constituent services and proposed a bill for the gradual, compensated emancipation of slaves in the District of Columbia, but it went nowhere. Feeling disillusioned and politically isolated, Lincoln left Washington in 1849. His national political career seemingly over, he returned to Springfield, convinced that his time in politics had come to an end. For the next 5 years, he threw himself into his law practice, becoming one of the most sought-after lawyers in Illinois. He rode the legal circuit, arguing cases in small-town courthouses, honing his skills of logic and persuasion. It seemed as though the story of Lincoln the politician had ended, and the story of Lincoln the successful lawyer would be his final chapter. But history had other plans. These early years in politics, from the grassroots of the Illinois legislature to the national stage of Congress, were not a failure. They were a crucial apprenticeship. He had learned how to navigate complex political landscapes, how to articulate a principled argument, and how to weather the storm of public opinion. He had tasted both victory and defeat. This period of seeming political exile was really a time of preparation, a quiet interlude before the storm. A new, far more dangerous political crisis was brewing, one that would challenge the very existence of the nation. And when that crisis came, Abraham Lincoln, the former state legislator and 1-term congressman, would be ready. His journey was far from over. In many ways, it was just about to begin. Thanks for watching. If you found this glimpse into Lincoln's early career interesting, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories from history. See you next time. Hello and welcome back to our series on American history. Today, we're rediving into one of the most contentious periods in the nation has passed, the decades leading up to the Civil War, when the debate over slavery reached a boiling point. This wasn't just a political disagreement, it was a profound moral and economic conflict that threatened to tear the country apart. From its very inception, the United States was a house divided. The ideals of liberty and equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence stood in stark contrast to the brutal reality of slavery. In the early 19th century, this contradiction became impossible to ignore. The nation was expanding westward, and with every new territory acquired, a critical question arose. Would it be a free state or a slave state? The answer would determine the balance of power in Congress and the very future of the country. The first major crisis erupted in 1819 when Missouri applied for statehood. At the time, there was a delicate balance: 11 free states and 11 slave states. Missouri's admission as a slave state would tip that balance in favor of the South, giving them more power in the Senate. The debate was fierce. Northerners, many of whom were part of a growing abolitionist movement, were horrified at the prospect of slavery expanding. Southerners, whose economy was deeply reliant on enslaved labor, saw any restriction as a threat to their way of life and their property rights. After months of heated arguments, a solution was reached: the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This was a package deal. Missouri would be admitted to the Union as a slave state, but to maintain the balance, Maine, which had been part of Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state. More importantly, the compromise drew a line across the country at the 3630 parallel. With the exception of Missouri itself, slavery would be prohibited in all new territories north of this line. For a time, it seemed like the crisis was averted. Thomas Jefferson, however, famously called it a fire bell in the night, warning that this was only a temporary reprieve, not a final resolution. He knew the deep divisions wouldn't just disappear. And he was right. The issue of slavery continued to simmer beneath the surface of American politics. Tensions flared up again with the annexation of Texas in 1845 and the Mexican-American War that followed. The vast new territories acquired from Mexico, including modern-day California, Nevada, and Utah, reignited the debate. What would be the status of slavery in these lands? The Compromise of 1850 was another attempt to patch things up. California was admitted as a free state, which pleased the North. But to appease the South, the deal included a much stricter Fugitive Slave Act. This law was incredibly controversial. It required all citizens, even those in free states, to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. Federal commissioners were paid more for returning a suspected slave than for freeing them, creating a corrupt incentive. This law brought the harsh reality of slavery directly into the North. Many Northerners who had been indifferent were now confronted with the moral horror of the system, as they witnessed free black people being kidnapped and sent into slavery with little legal recourse. This act radicalized many and fueled the abolitionist cause like never before. Books like Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, exposed the cruelty of slavery to a massive audience and further deepened the divide between North and South. But the most explosive development was yet to come. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced a bill that would shatter the fragile peace: the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Douglas wanted to build a transcontinental railroad that would start in his home state of Illinois. To get Southern support, he proposed a radical idea. The act would create two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and it would allow the settlers in those territories to decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This principle was called popular sovereignty. The problem: both Kansas and Nebraska were north of the 3630 line established by the Missouri Compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act effectively repealed that compromise, which had been the law of the land for over 30 years. The reaction was immediate and furious. The North saw it as a betrayal, a blatant attempt to spread slavery into territories that were supposed to be free forever. The consequences were disastrous, particularly in Kansas. Popular sovereignty turned the territory into a battleground. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into Kansas, each side determined to win the vote and control the future state's constitution. Violence erupted. Pro-slavery forces from Missouri, known as Border Ruffians, crossed into Kansas to intimidate anti-slavery settlers and cast fraudulent votes. In response, anti-slavery settlers, known as Free Staters, armed themselves for a fight. This period became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was a brutal, small-scale civil war. Towns were sacked, people were murdered, and a shadow government was formed. The violence wasn't just confined to the frontier. In 1856, On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner gave a fiery anti-slavery speech. A few days later, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina, whose relative Sumner had insulted in the speech, walked into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner senseless with a heavy cane. Sumner was so badly injured, he couldn't return to the Senate for 3 years. In the North, Brooks was condemned as a savage. In the South, he was hailed as a hero. People sent him new canes to replace the one he broke. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, and the caning of Charles Sumner revealed just how broken the political system had become. The old compromises were no longer working. The two major political parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, fractured along sectional lines. In their place, a new party emerged in the North, the Republican Party. Their central platform was simple and powerful: stop the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. By the late 1850s, the nation was on a collision course. The Supreme Court Dred Scott decision in 1857 declared that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights, and that Congress could not ban slavery in the territories. This was a stunning victory for the South and a devastating blow to the anti-slavery movement. It seemed to confirm the North-West fears that a slave power conspiracy was controlling the federal government. The rising debate over slavery wasn't just about politics or economics. It was a battle for the soul of America. Every attempt at compromise only seemed to push the two sides further apart, hardening their positions and making a peaceful resolution seem impossible. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act were all meant to be solutions. But in the end, they were just stepping stones on the path to a conflict that would finally settle the question of slavery, not with words, but with blood. The stage was set for the election of 1860 and the outbreak of the American Civil War. Thank you for watching. If you found this video informative, please give it a like. Subscribe for more history content, and let us know in the comments what topic you'd like to see next. We'll see you in the next chapter. Picture this. It's 1858, and the United States is a nation on edge, a powder keg of tension ready to explode. The issue? Slavery. And at the heart of this storm, two men from Illinois are about to step onto the national stage for a series of debates that will change the course of American history. This is the story of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. On one side, we have Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant. He's a powerful and famous Democratic senator, a political heavyweight known for his booming voice and confident presence. Douglas is the champion of popular sovereignty. The idea that the settlers in each new territory should vote for themselves whether to allow slavery. To him, this is the democratic solution. A way to take the explosive issue out of Washington and let the people decide, state by state. He's a polished performer, and he's fighting to keep his Senate seat. On the other side is a relative underdog, a tall, lanky lawyer from Springfield named Abraham Lincoln. He's the Republican challenger. At this point, Lincoln isn't the national icon we know today. He's a former one-term congressman, known for his sharp mind, folksy wisdom, and a growing conviction that the nation cannot continue half-slave and half-free. He sees slavery not just as a political issue, but as a profound moral wrong that contradicts the very principles of the Declaration of Independence. The stage was set for 7 debates, held in 7 different towns across Illinois, from August to October of 1858. These weren't quiet, academic discussions. They were huge, outdoor events. Thousands of people would travel for miles, by horse, wagon, and train, to stand for hours in the hot sun or pouring rain just to hear these two men argue. Newspapers sent reporters to transcribe every word, and their accounts were printed and spread across the country. For the first time, a local state election was becoming a national spectacle. The core of their argument was the future of slavery in the expanding American territories. Douglas would start, often painting Lincoln as a radical abolitionist, an extremist who wanted to force racial equality on the nation. He'd stoke the fears of the white working class, claiming Lincoln's policies would lead to a flood of freed slaves taking their jobs. Douglas was a master debater, skilled at putting his opponent on the defensive. He'd frame his popular sovereignty doctrine as the common-sense middle ground, the only way to preserve the Union. Then, it would be Lincoln's turn. He had a very different style. You said logic, simple stories, and piercing questions to dismantle Douglas's arguments. Lincoln consistently denied that he was an abolitionist or that he sought perfect social and political equality between the races, a radical position for the time. Instead, he focused on the moral question. He would argue that if slavery wasn't wrong, then nothing was wrong. He famously declared, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He believed the nation couldn't endure permanently as half slave and half free. Sooner or later, it would have to become all one thing or all the other. Lincoln's genius was in forcing Douglas into a corner. The most famous moment came during the second debate in Freeport. Lincoln asked Douglas a brilliant, calculated question. It's now known as the Freeport Doctrine. He asked, "Can the people of a United States territory, in any lawful way, exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?" This was a trap. If Douglas said no, he would be aligning himself with the Supreme Court's recent Dred Scott decision, which stated that territories could not ban slavery. This would destroy his popular sovereignty platform and lose him support in the North, including Illinois. But if he said yes, he would be defying the Supreme Court and angering the powerful Southern wing of his own Democratic Party, who saw the Dred Scott decision as a huge victory. Douglas was stuck. He answered, yes. He argued that even if a territory couldn't formally ban slavery, the local population could effectively keep it out by simply not passing any local laws to protect slave property. No slave patrols, no local enforcement. This clever answer was enough to win him the debate and, ultimately, the Illinois Senate race. The state legislature, which chose senators back then, went for Douglas. So, on the surface, Lincoln lost. He did not become a senator in 1858. But in the grand scheme of things, he won something far more valuable. Douglas's Freeport Doctrine answer did exactly what Lincoln had hoped. It split the Democratic Party. The South felt betrayed by Douglas, viewing him as unreliable on the issue of slavery. This split would prove fatal for the Democrats in the presidential election 2 years later. Meanwhile, the debates had transformed Abraham Lincoln. He went from being a local Illinois politician to a national figure. His speeches, printed in newspapers far and wide, showcased his powerful intellect, his moral clarity, and his moderate yet firm stance against the expansion of slavery. Republicans in the North and East read his words and saw a thoughtful, compelling leader. They saw a man who could articulate the party's core principles better than anyone else. He had established himself as the leading voice of the opposition to Douglas and the pro-slavery agenda. The Lincoln-Douglas debates were a defining moment for America. They laid bare the deep, irreconcilable divisions in the country. They framed the central questions that would soon lead to the Civil War. And they launched a man who lost a Senate race onto the path to the presidency. In losing the battle for the Senate, Abraham Lincoln had positioned himself to win the war for the soul of the nation. The groundwork for his 1860 presidential victory was laid not in Washington, D.C., but on the dusty debate stages of small-town Illinois. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories that shaped our world. See you next time. The 1850s were a turbulent time in America. The country was being torn apart over the issue of slavery, and the existing political parties were failing to provide real solutions. Out of this chaos, a new political force was born, one that would fundamentally change the course of American history. The Republican Party. Today, we're diving into Chapter 8 of Overseas, the birth of the Republican Party. Before the 1850s, the two major parties were the Democrats and the Whigs. The Democratic Party was largely dominated by Southern interests and was a staunch defender of slavery. The Whig Party, on the other hand, was a bit more complicated. It had members from both the North and the South, which meant they tried to avoid the issue of slavery altogether to keep their coalition together. But as tensions mounted, this strategy of avoidance became impossible. The spark that lit the fuse was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This controversial law, pushed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas, proposed that the settlers in the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska should decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This principle was called popular sovereignty. On the surface, it might sound democratic, but it effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which had banned slavery in this part of the country for over 3 decades. For many in the North, this was the last straw. They saw it as a blatant attempt by the slave power, the political influence of wealthy slaveholders, to expand their institution into new territories and increase their control over the federal government. The Whig Party, unable to take a firm stand, fractured and collapsed. Anti-slavery Whigs, disillusioned Northern Democrats, and members of the Free Soil Party, who were dedicated to stopping the spread of slavery, were left politically homeless. They needed a new banner to rally under. This is where the Republican Party enters the story. In early 1854, small groups of these anti-slavery activists began meeting in the upper Midwest. One of the most famous meetings took place in a small schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. Another key gathering happened in Jackson, Michigan, where the party officially adopted its name and platform. Their central, unifying belief was simple but powerful. Slavery must not be allowed to expand into the Western territories. They weren't necessarily abolitionists calling for the immediate end of slavery everywhere. Many early Republicans respected that the Constitution protected slavery where it already existed, but they drew a firm line in the sand when it came to the West. They believed that these new territories should be reserved for free labor, for small farmers and workers who could build a life without having to compete with the unpaid labor of enslaved people. They argued that the spread of slavery was not only morally wrong but also degraded the dignity of free work and threatened the economic opportunities of ordinary white Americans. This is where Abraham Lincoln comes into the picture. Lincoln had been a loyal Whig for his entire political career. He had even served a term in Congress in the late 1840s. But after that, he had largely retired from politics to focus on a successful law practice. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, however, jolted him back into the political arena. He was, in his own words, aroused as he had never been before. Lincoln despised slavery. He believed it was a moral, social, and political wrong. But like many moderates, he wasn't an abolitionist. He believed in a gradual, compensated emancipation and colonization of freed slaves. His main outrage over the Kansas-Nebraska Act was its reversal of a long-standing national policy that restricted slavery's growth. He saw it as a step backward for the nation's founding ideals. In a series of powerful speeches, most famously in Peoria, Illinois, in October 1854, Lincoln laid out his arguments. He methodically dismantled Stephen Douglas's idea of popular sovereignty, calling it a fraud. How could you be neutral about something as fundamentally wrong as slavery? He argued that the founders had intended to put slavery on a course of ultimate extinction by containing it, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act betrayed that vision. For a time, Lincoln was hesitant to join the new Republican Party. It seemed too radical to single issue for his taste. He hoped the Whig Party might somehow be revived. But as the events of the mid-Italian 50s unfolded, particularly the violence in Bleeding Kansas where pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers clashed, it became clear that a new political alignment was necessary. By 1856, Lincoln had fully committed. He saw that the Republican Party was the only viable vehicle for opposing the expansion of slavery. He became one of its leading figures in Illinois. At the state Republican convention in Bloomington, he gave a legendary speech, so captivating that reporters supposedly forgot to take notes. This is often called his lost speech. What we do know is that it cemented his position as a leader of the new party. That same year, the Republicans ran their first presidential candidate, John Fremont, under the slogan Free Soil, Free Speech, Free Men, and Fremont. While Fremont lost the election to the Democrat James Buchanan, the results were stunning. The Republican Party, only 2 years old, had carried 11 of the 16 free states and won a third of the popular vote. They had proven they were a serious political force, the main opposition to the pro-slavery Democrats. The birth of the Republican Party reshaped American politics. It created a party based on a clear moral and economic principle. The opposition to the expansion of slavery. It gave a political home to a diverse coalition of Northerners who felt their values and interests were being ignored. And it set the stage for one of its most eloquent spokesmen, Abraham Lincoln, to rise to national prominence. The ideas he honed in the 1850s that slavery was a moral wrong, that the nation could not endure, permanently, half-slave, and all-free, and that the Union must be preserved would become the very foundation of his presidency. The party born in a small Wisconsin schoolhouse was now on a collision course with the institution of slavery, a collision that would lead directly to the Civil War and the ultimate remaking of the nation. Thanks for watching. If you found this chapter of American history interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more. We'll see you in the next video as we explore the final steps on the road to
Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 9, a pivotal moment where a nation stood on the brink, teetering towards an election that would change its destiny forever. The year is 1860, and the air is thick with tension. It's a time of deep division, where the very fabric of the United States feels like it's about to unravel. The political landscape is a chaotic mess. The Democratic Party, once a unifying force, has fractured. Imagine a grand political convention, not in some smoke-filled back room, but in the heart of Charleston, South Carolina. This was the Democrats' chance to choose a candidate who could hold the country together. But instead of unity, the convention became a battleground. At the center of the storm was Stephen Douglas, a prominent senator from Illinois. The Northern Democrats largely supported him. They championed a concept called popular sovereignty, which basically meant letting the settlers in new territories decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It sounded like a compromise, a middle ground. But for the Southern Democrats, it wasn't enough. They saw it as a betrayal. The Southern faction, often called the Fire Eaters, they demanded federal protection for slavery in all territories, no matter what the local settlers wanted. To them, anything less was an attack on their way of life, their economy, and their constitutional rights as they interpreted them. The Charleston Convention was a pressure cooker. The delegates argued, debated, and shouted, but they couldn't agree. The Southern delegates, feeling their demands were ignored, made a dramatic exit. They walked out, leaving the convention in chaos, and the party split in two. So what happens when a major political party The Northern Democrats eventually nominated Stephen Douglas, but the Southern Democrats held their own separate convention. They chose their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge, the sitting vice president. Suddenly, the Democratic vote was split right down the middle, creating a golden opportunity for their opponents. And who were their opponents? The young but ambitious Republican Party. Formed just a few years earlier, the Republicans had a clear stance. They opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. They weren't abolitionists in the sense that they wanted to end slavery where it already existed, but they were determined to contain it. Their platform was a direct threat to the Southern way of life and its future expansion. As the election year progressed, the Republicans saw their chance. They needed a candidate who could appeal to a wide range of voters in the North and West. They needed someone who was firm on slavery as expansion but not so radical as to scare away moderates. At their convention in Chicago, a surprising figure emerged from the pack, a lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't the initial favorite, but his powerful speeches, his humble origins, and his moderate yet firm stance on slavery made him a compelling choice. He represented the promise of free labor and opportunity for all, a message that resonated deeply in the North. But there was another twist. A fourth party entered the fray, the Constitutional Union Party. This group was made up of former Whigs and moderate Democrats who were terrified of the country breaking apart. Their platform was simple, almost comically, so they stood for the Constitution of the country, the Union of the states, and the enforcement of the laws. They nominated John Bell of Tennessee. Their entire campaign was a desperate plea for everyone to just calm down and stick together, avoiding the slavery issue altogether. So, picture the scene. It's the fall of 1860. You have four candidates vying for the presidency. Lincoln for the Republicans, Douglas for the Northern Democrats, Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and Bell for the Constitutional Unionists. The country was essentially voting in two separate elections. In the North, the main contest was between Lincoln and Douglas. In the South, it was a battle between Breckinridge and Bell. The rhetoric was fiery. Newspapers and politicians on all sides painted grim pictures of what would happen if their opponents won. Southerners openly declared that a Lincoln victory would be an act of war, a sign that the North intended to dominate them and destroy their institutions. The threat of secessionist states leaving the Union was no longer a whisper. It was a loud, angry shout. People talked about it on street corners, debated it in parlors, and wrote about it in editorials. You can feel the fear and anxiety that gripped the nation. Families were divided. Friendships were strained. The sense that something terrible was about to happen was palpable. People looked at their neighbors and wondered if they would soon be enemies. The very idea of the United States seemed to be dissolving. The nation was holding its breath, waiting for the results of the election, knowing that the outcome would either pull them back from the edge or push them over into a chasm of disunion and conflict. When the votes were counted in November 1860, the results confirmed the nation's deep divisions. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, but he did it without carrying a single Southern state. In fact, in many Southern states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. He won because he swept the populous North, securing a majority of the electoral votes. The split in the Democratic Party had been fatal. Douglas, despite coming in second in the popular vote, won very few electoral votes. Breckinridge carried the Deep South, and Bell picked up a few border states. The outcome was a political earthquake. For the South, their worst fears had been realized. A man they saw as a hostile, sectional president had been elected. A man who, in their eyes, represented a party dedicated to the destruction of their society. They felt they had no voice, no power left in the federal government. The election, which is supposed to be a moment of national unity and decision, had instead become the final trigger. The talk of secession turned into action. Before Lincoln could even be inaugurated, South Carolina led the way, officially declaring its departure from the Union. Other states in the Deep South quickly followed. They believed they were acting to protect their rights and their liberty, just as the Founding Fathers had done. To them, the Union was a voluntary pact, and the federal government had broken its terms. The nation was now fractured. The election of 1860, instead of resolving the country's issues, had brought them to a head. The divisions that had been simmering for decades over slavery, economics, and culture had finally boiled over. The lines were drawn. The hopes for compromise had faded, replaced by the grim reality of a house divided against itself. A nation that had been born in a fight for independence now faced a fight for its very survival. The path to civil war was now tragically clear. This was a time of immense pressure and heartbreaking decisions. The election of 1860 wasn't just a political contest. It was a referendum on the future of America itself. And the result set the stage for the most painful and defining chapter in the nation's history. Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter. See you next time.
The year is 1860, and the United States is a powder keg ready to explode. The young Republican Party, just 6 years old, gathers in Chicago for its second-ever national convention. The stakes couldn't be higher. The nation is fracturing over the issue of slavery, and the man they choose as their presidential nominee could either pull the country back from the brink or push it headfirst into civil war. The convention hall, a massive wooden structure called the wigwam, is packed with 10,000 delegates, reporters, and spectators, all buzzing with anticipation. The frontrunner, by a long shot, is William H. Seward, a senator from New York. He's a political giant, a leading voice of the anti-slavery movement. His supporters are confident, parading through the streets of Chicago with marching bands and extravagant displays. They believe his nomination is a foregone conclusion. Other powerful contenders include Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, a staunch abolitionist, and Edward Bates of Missouri, a more conservative choice. And then there's the dark horse, a lawyer from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. To most of the country, Lincoln is a long shot. He's known for his powerful debates with Stephen Douglas, but he's seen as a regional candidate, a homespun lawyer with limited national experience compared to his rivals. But Lincoln and his team have a brilliant, understated strategy. While Seward's team projects an air of inevitability, Lincoln's managers, led by the sharp and determined David Davis, work tirelessly behind the scenes. Their headquarters is the Tremont House Hotel, just a block from the wigwam, and it becomes the nerve center of their operation. Their strategy is twofold. First, they present Lincoln as the most electable candidate. They argue that while Seward is a brilliant man, his strong, sometimes radical anti-slavery rhetoric has made him too many enemies. He's seen as a radical in the crucial swing states of the lower North Pennsylvania, Indiana, and Illinois. The Lincoln team relentlessly pushes the message. Seward can't win the general election, but Lincoln can. He's a moderate, a man from the West who can appeal to a broader range of voters. He's firm on preventing the extension of slavery. But he doesn't have the baggage of radicalism that clings to Seward and Chase. Second, they emphasize Lincoln's character and his story. The rail splitter image is born right here in Chicago. They portray him as a man of the people, an honest, self-made frontiersman who embodies the American dream. This narrative resonates powerfully in the young, dynamic city of Chicago and across the rapidly growing West. They cleverly distribute tickets to the wigwam, packing the galleries with thousands of roaring Lincoln supporters from Illinois and Indiana, creating an overwhelming sense of popular support inside the convention hall. The first day of the convention, May 16th, is all about organization and speeches. The second day is dedicated to building the party platform. The key plank is a firm stance against the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. This is non-negotiable, but the platform is also carefully crafted to appeal to a wider audience, including support for a transcontinental railroad, homesteads for settlers in the West, and protective tariffs for northern industries. It's a platform designed for victory. Finally, on Friday, May 18th, the balloting begins. The atmosphere in the wigwam is electric. 10,000 people are crammed inside, with another 20,000 gathered outside, desperate for news. The nominations are made, and the roll call for the first ballot starts. As the states are called, the tally board shows Seward in the lead, with 173.5 votes. Lincoln is a surprisingly strong second, with 102 votes. Chase and other candidates trail behind. Seward is ahead, but he's short of the 233 votes needed for the nomination. A nervous murmur ripples through the Seward camp. Their man was supposed to win on the first ballot. This is where Lincoln's managers prove their genius. Between ballots, they work the floor with surgical precision. They had anticipated this. Their strategy wasn't to win on the first ballot, but to show strength and then consolidate the anti-Seward vote. They approached the delegates from Pennsylvania and Indiana, reminding them that their states are must-wins in the general election and that Lincoln is their only sure bet. They make promises of cabinet positions and federal appointments, the classic horse trading of political conventions. It's not about bribery, but about building a winning coalition and ensuring that key factions have a place in a future Lincoln administration. The second ballot is called "The Tension is Unbearable." As the votes are announced, you can hear a shift. Seward's total barely budges, climbing to 184.5. But Lincoln's support surges. Pennsylvania swings almost its entire delegation to him. His total jumps to 181 votes, nearly tied with the frontrunner. The crowd erupts. The Lincoln supporters in the galleries, strategically placed and cued by a man on the roof, let out a thunderous roar that shakes the building. The sound is described by one reporter as like the rush of a great river. Seward's campaign is visibly shaken. The momentum has completely shifted. Now, it's all or nothing. The third ballot begins. The hall is dead silent as the clerk calls the roll, state by state. The votes for the minor candidates collapse and flock to Lincoln. Massachusetts switches 4 of its votes from Seward to Lincoln. Then Ohio, Chase's home state, delivers the decisive blow. 4 of its delegates shift their support to Lincoln. The clerk announces the new tally. Lincoln has 231.5 votes, just 1.5 votes shy of nomination. Before the final result can even be announced, a delegate from Ohio leaps onto his chair and shouts that he wants to change for more votes to Lincoln. It's over. Pandemonium erupts. A cannon on the roof of the wigwam fires, signaling the news to the massive crowd outside. The city of Chicago explodes in celebration. Inside the hall, delegates are shouting, crying, and hugging. Men are thrown into the air. The sound is deafening. The dark horse from Illinois, the humble lawyer, the rail splitter, had done the impossible. He had defeated the most powerful man in the party and was now the Republican nominee for President of the United States. Back in Springfield, Lincoln was waiting for the news at the local newspaper office. When the telegram arrived confirming his nomination, he remained characteristically calm. According to witnesses, he simply said, "Well, gentlemen, there's a little woman at our house who is probably more interested in this news than I am, and if you will, excuse me, I will go and tell her." He had outmaneuvered the giants of his party with a brilliant combination of principle, pragmatism, and political skill. But the celebration would be short-lived. The real fight, the fight for the soul of the nation, was just beginning. The path from the wigwam in Chicago would lead directly to the White House, and inevitably, to the battlefields of the Civil War. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the past. Let me know in the comments who you think was the most strategic political figure in American history. See you next time. The spring of 1860 arrived, painting the American landscape in vibrant greens and florals. But beneath this serene surface, a political storm was gathering force. The presidential campaign had officially begun, and it was unlike any the nation had ever witnessed. For major candidates now vied for the highest office. Abraham Lincoln for the Republicans, Stephen Douglas for the Northern Democrats, John Breckinridge for the Southern Democrats, and John Bell for the new Constitutional Union Party. The country was fractured, and the election felt less like a political contest and more like a battle for the very soul of the nation. In the North, the campaign season kicked off with an almost festival-like atmosphere. Towns and cities buzzed with energy. Torchlight parades snaked through the streets at night, the flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows on buildings. Men, women, and children gathered in town squares and at rail yard depots to hear passionate speeches from party surrogates. Political rallies were grand spectacles, complete with brass bands, fireworks, and soaring banners that proclaimed party slogans. The Republican Party, in particular, was masterful at this. T.O.R.Gaines said wide-awakes, clubs of young men who marched in military-style formations, wearing oilcloth capes and carrying lanterns. They were a powerful symbol of a vigilant, organized, and energetic North, ready to stand for their principles. The newspapers became the primary battlegrounds of ideas. Editors loyal to their respective parties engaged in fierce debates, their printing presses running day and night. Pro-Lincoln papers like Horace Greeley's New York Tribune hailed him as Honest Abe, a man of the people, a self-made frontiersman who embodied the American dream. They painted him as a firm but moderate leader who would stand against the expansion of slavery while preserving the Union. Cartoons depicted him as a strong rail splitter, ready to chop through the tangled log of political corruption and disunion. The excitement was palpable. For many in the North, Lincoln's candidacy represented a chance for real change, a moral stand against an institution they had come to despise. Meanwhile, in the South, the mood was starkly different. Excitement was replaced by a deep and pervasive sense of anxiety and distrust. The very name Lincoln was spoken with contempt and fear. Southern newspapers portrayed him not as a moderate, but as a dangerous radical, a black Republican abolitionist. In disguise, they warned that his election would be a direct threat to their way of life, their economy, and their constitutional rights, particularly the right to own slaves. Political cartoons in the South depicted Lincoln as a grotesque figure, a fiend unleashing chaos upon a genteel Southern society. The campaign rhetoric wasn't about celebration, it was about survival. Talk of secession, once a fringe idea, now entered mainstream conversation. The South felt cornered, believing that a Republican victory would mean their subjugation, leading many to openly declare that Lincoln's election would be grounds for leaving the Union. Amidst this national whirlwind of passion and panic, the man at the center of it all, Abraham Lincoln, did something remarkably unconventional for a presidential candidate. From his modest two-story house on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln conducted what would become known as a front porch campaign. It was a deliberate and strategic choice. He had already made his views clear in numerous speeches and debates, most famously with Stephen Douglas. He believed any further public statements would only be twisted and misrepresented by his opponents, especially in the volatile South. His silence was a strategy. By staying quiet, He allowed his party to control the message and prevented himself from making any missteps that could alienate crucial voters. His home became the nerve center of the Republican campaign. A steady stream of visitors made the pilgrimage to Springfield. Party leaders, journalists, artists, and ordinary well-wishers all came to see the man who might be the next president. Lincoln would greet them in his parlor, a tall, sometimes awkward figure with a warm, engaging manner. He would listen more than he spoke, gathering information, gauging public opinion, and offering quiet guidance to his campaign managers. He spent his days reading newspapers from across the country, meticulously tracking the campaign's progress. He corresponded extensively, writing hundreds of letters to supporters and strategists, his handwriting neat and precise. He offered advice on everything from rally organization to the wording of campaign pamphlets. This approach projected an image of calm and confidence, while his opponents crisscrossed the country delivering fiery speeches. Lincoln appeared dignified and statesmanlike, above the political fray. He was a man tending to his affairs at home, ready to answer the nation's call, if chosen. Photographers and portrait painters also visited, and the images they created were crucial. They captured a thoughtful, serious man. The famous Matthew Brady photograph from this period shows a clean-shaven Lincoln, looking resolute and intelligent. These images were mass-produced and distributed, helping to shape a public persona for a candidate many Americans had never seen. He was no longer just a name, but a face, a steady, reassuring presence in a time of growing uncertainty. As the summer wore on, the contrast between North and South only intensified. The Republican campaign gained momentum, fueled by a powerful anti-slavery sentiment and a desire for economic progress. The Democratic Party, split in two, struggled to present a united front. Douglas campaigned tirelessly, a heroic but ultimately tragic figure, trying to hold the center. As the extremes pulled the country apart, he was the only candidate to campaign in both the North and the South, warning everywhere he went that the nation was on the brink of disaster. Breckinridge solidified his support in the Deep South, his campaign becoming a vehicle for pro-slavery and states' rights radicals. And John Bell, the constitutional unionist, offered a simple but vague plea: the Union, the Constitution, and the enforcement of the laws. Back in Springfield, Lincoln watched it all unfold. He received daily reports, analyzed voter data from different states, and managed the delicate coalition of former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, and nativists that made up the Republican Party. His front porch campaign was a masterclass in political strategy. It allowed him to remain a powerful symbol while avoiding direct confrontation. He was the calm eye of the hurricane, a figure of stability as the winds of division howled ever louder. As autumn approached and election day drew near, the nation held its breath. The campaign of 1860 had laid bare the deep, irreconcilable differences that divided the American people. The question on everyone's mind was no longer just who would win, but whether the United States of America could even survive the outcome. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this journey into history, please like and subscribe for more. Men gathered in public squares and saloons, their voices raised, their loyalties fiercely proclaimed. They weren't just voting against Lincoln. They were voting to preserve a world they believed was ordained and just. Their votes were split among three other candidates: Stephen Douglas, John Breckinridge, and John Bell, each representing a different, desperate hope for holding the Union together, but on Southern terms. Welcome back to our journey through American history. Today, we re-diving into one of the most pivotal moments the country has ever faced. The presidential election of 1860. The results of this election would not just decide the next president, they would set the stage for the American Civil War. So, let's set the scene. The year is 1860, and the United States is a nation on edge, deeply divided over the issue of slavery. The political landscape was fractured, and this was perfectly reflected in the presidential race. There weren't just two major candidates, there were four. First, you have Abraham Lincoln, the nominee for the relatively new Republican Party. Their platform was clear. They opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. They weren't abolitionists, in the sense that they wanted to end slavery where it already existed. But their stance against its spread was a direct challenge to the Southern way of life and economy. For many in the North, Lincoln represented a moral and economic future that wasn't dependent on enslaved labor. Then there was the Democratic Party, which had completely split apart over the slavery issue. The Northern Democrats nominated Stephen A. Douglas. He was a proponent of popular sovereignty, the idea that the settlers in each new territory should vote for themselves whether to allow slavery. It sounded like a democratic compromise, but in reality, it just exported the conflict to the frontier, as we saw with Bleeding Kansas. The Southern Democrats, feeling that Douglas didn't do enough to protect their interests, broke away and nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge. His platform was the polar opposite of Lincoln's. He argued that the federal government had a duty to protect slavery in all territories, a position that was completely unacceptable to the North. And finally, to complicate things even further, there was a fourth party called the Constitutional Union Party. They nominated John Bell. Their entire platform was essentially to ignore the slavery issue and just focus on keeping the country together under the Constitution. They were the party of compromise, hoping to find a middle ground that, by 1860, simply no longer existed. So you have four candidates, each representing a different vision for America's future. Lincoln for the anti-slavery expansion North, Breckinridge for the pro-slavery South, Douglas for the popular sovereignty middle ground, and Bell for those who just wanted to avoid the conflict altogether. Election day arrives, November 6, 1860. When the votes were counted, the results were stark and revealed just how divided the nation had become. Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, but how he won is the crucial part of this story. Lincoln secured a decisive victory in the Electoral College, winning 180 electoral votes. To win, a candidate needed 152. So, on paper, it looks like a solid victory. And in the popular vote, he got about 40% of the total, more than any other candidate. But here is the detail that shook the nation to its core. Let us look at the map of the results. It's like looking at two different countries. Lincoln absolutely dominated the North. He won every single free state, from Maine to California and Oregon on the Pacific coast. The industrial and populous states of the North, like New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, all went firmly for Lincoln. In many of these northern states, he won with overwhelming majorities. His name and his party's platform resonated deeply with the anti-slavery sentiment and the economic vision of the free labor North. Now, let's shift our gaze to the South. The map tells a completely different story. Abraham Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. Think about that. The man who would become president was not even an option for voters in a huge part of the country. In the South, the vote was split primarily between the Southern Democrat, Breckinridge, and the Constitutional Unionist, John Bell. Breckinridge carried the Deep South states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Florida. Bell picked up a few of the border states like Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, where the desire to preserve the Union was strongest. Stephen Douglas, despite coming in second in the popular vote nationwide, had a surprisingly poor showing in the Electoral College. He only managed to win one state outright, Missouri, and split the electoral votes of New Jersey with Lincoln. So, what does this map tell us? It shows a country that had voted along stark sectional lines. Lincoln was the president of the North. He won the White House without carrying a single southern state. Not one, His victory was achieved entirely with the electoral votes of the free states. For the South, this was their worst fear realized. From their perspective, a candidate who was openly hostile to their institution of slavery, the foundation of their economy and society, been elected president by a purely sectional northern vote. They felt they had lost their voice, their power, and their representation in the federal government. They saw the election of Lincoln not just as a political defeat, but as an existential threat. The idea that the North could elect a president without any Southern support confirmed their belief that they were now a permanent minority in the Union. They felt that their way of life was under direct attack, and that the federal government would now be used as a tool to destroy it. In the weeks and months following Lincoln's victory, the reaction in the South was swift and dramatic. The talk of secession, which had been brewing for years, now boiled over. Southern leaders declared that the Union had been broken by the North's aggression. They argued that they had no choice but to leave the Union to protect their rights and their property, meaning enslaved people. On December 20th, 1860, before Lincoln was even inaugurated, South Carolina became the first state to officially secede from the United States. In their declaration, they cited the election of a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Over the next few weeks, 6 more states, from the Deep South, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas would follow, forming the Confederate States of America. The election of 1860 was, therefore, the final trigger. It was on the sole cause of the Civil War that tensions had been building for decades, but it was the event that made the conflict unavoidable. Lincoln's victory, achieved without a single Southern vote, demonstrated in the clearest possible terms that the United States was no longer one nation politically or ideologically. It was 2 distinct societies, with irreconcilable differences, coexisting under one flag. Lincoln himself had famously said a few years earlier that a house divided against itself cannot stand. The election of 1860 proved his point. The House was now hopelessly divided, and the man who had warned of its collapse was now tasked with the impossible job of putting it back together. He would be inaugurated in March 1861, facing a fractured republic and the looming shadow of war. The stage was set for the nation's greatest trial. Thank you for watching. We'll explore the immediate aftermath and the first shots of the Civil War in our next video. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter in our story. See you next time. Hello history buffs, and welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. Today, we're diving deep into Chapter 14. The South reacts. This is a pivotal moment, the point where the simmering tensions finally boil over. To understand what happens next, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of the Southern states in late 1860. The election of Abraham Lincoln was the spark that lit the fuse. Now, it is important to remember that Lincoln and the Republican Party's platform was not about abolishing slavery where it already existed. Their primary goal was to prevent its expansion into the new Western territories. For many in the North, this was a moral and political compromise. But for the South, this was an existential threat. Why? Because the entire Southern economy, social structure, and political power were built on the institution of slavery. For decades, a delicate balance had been maintained in Congress between free and slave states. This balance ensured that legislation hostile to Southern interests, particularly slavery, could be blocked. The admission of new states was always a point of contention. Think about the Missouri Compromise or the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These were all attempts to manage this expansion issue. So when Lincoln won without a single Southern electoral vote, it sent a clear and terrifying message to the slaveholding states. They saw the writing on the wall. If slavery couldn't expand, the political balance would inevitably tip in favor of the free states. Over time, the North would gain enough power in Congress to potentially amend the Constitution and abolish slavery everywhere. From their perspective, the federal government, now under the control of a party openly hostile to their way of life, could no longer be trusted to protect their interests or their property, which included enslaved people. The fear wasn't just economic. It was deeply cultural and social. Southern leaders and ideologues had spent years crafting a defense of slavery, not just as a necessary evil, but as a positive good. They argued it was beneficial for both the enslaver and the enslaved, a cornerstone of a stable, hierarchical society. They viewed the Republican anti-slavery stance as a direct attack on their honor, their values, and their entire civilization. The rhetoric of the time was incredibly charged. Southern newspapers and politicians painted a grim picture of a future under Republican rule, economic ruin, social chaos, and the loss of their fundamental rights as they saw them. This brings us to South Carolina. More than any other state, South Carolina had a long history of radicalism in defending states' rights, a concept known as nullification. They had threatened to leave the Union before, during the nullification crisis in the 1830s. So, it's no surprise they were the first to act. Immediately following Lincoln's election in November 1860, the South Carolina legislature called for a special convention to consider secession. The mood was defiant. There was very little debate on whether to secede, only on how and when. The delegates who gathered in Charleston were united in their purpose. They believed that the Union had been broken by the Northwest's aggression and that their only recourse was to leave it. On December 20th, 1860, the convention unanimously passed the Ordinance of Secession. The document was short and direct. It declared that the Union now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America is hereby dissolved. To the people of Charleston, this was a moment of celebration. Bells rang, crowds cheered, and palmetto flags, the symbol of their state, were waved everywhere. They saw themselves as patriots, following in the footsteps of the American revolutionaries of 1776, fighting for their liberty against a tyrannical government. In their declaration of the immediate causes which induce and justify the secession, they laid out their reasoning very clearly. The central grievance was what they called the North's failure to uphold its constitutional obligations, specifically regarding fugitive slaves. They argued that Northern states had actively obstructed the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act, thereby breaking the original compact of the Union. But the overarching theme was the threat to slavery. The document explicitly states that the federal government was becoming their enemy and that Lincoln's election meant the guarantees of the Constitution will then no longer exist. The equal rights of the states will be lost. The slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection, and the federal government will have become their enemy. The secession of South Carolina was a momentous gamble. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the United States. Many in the North, and even some in the South, hoped that this was just a radical threat, a negotiating tactic that would eventually be resolved through compromise, but they underestimated the depth of feeling and the resolve in the Deep South. South Carolina's bold move created a domino effect. Leaders in other slave states had been watching closely. They were now faced with a choice: remain in a union they felt was hostile, or join South Carolina in creating a new nation. Within weeks, the fire of secession spread across the Deep South. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and then Texas all held their own conventions and voted to leave the Union. Each state published its own declarations, and while they mentioned issues like tariffs and states' rights, the core, undeniable issue was the preservation of slavery. For example, Mississippi's declaration was blunt: our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. By February 1861, these 7 seceded states would meet in Montgomery, Alabama, to form the Confederate States of America. They would draft their own constitution, one that explicitly protected the institution of slavery in perpetuity. The stage was now set for a confrontation. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, argued that secession was illegal, but that the federal government had no constitutional power to stop it. He was essentially all eyes turned to the president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, who would be inaugurated in March. What would he do? Would he let the states go in peace? Would he try for one last grand compromise? Or would he use force to preserve the Union? The answer to that question would determine whether the nation plunged into a bloody civil war. South Carolina's act of secession on December 20th, 1860, was the point of no return. It transformed a political crisis into a national emergency, setting in motion the events that would lead to the first shots being fired at Fort Sumter, right there in Charleston Harbor. And that is a story for our next chapter. Thanks for watching. We've seen how Southern fears over the future of slavery crystallized by Lincoln's election, led South Carolina to take the drastic step of leaving the Union. This single act unleashed a wave of secession across the South. If you found this video helpful, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss Chapter 5, where we'll cover the formation of the Confederacy and the final countdown to war. See you next time. In the wake of Abraham Lincoln's election in November 1860, the long-simmering tensions between the North and South reached a boiling point. For many in the South, Lincoln's victory, representing a party opposed to the expansion of slavery, was the final straw. The talk of secession, once a fringe idea, now became a political reality. South Carolina, a longtime advocate for states' rights, was the first to act. On December 20th, 1860, a special convention in Charleston voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Their declaration stated that the federal government had broken its compact with the states and that South Carolina was once again an independent entity. The rest of the Deep South watched closely. The momentum of secession was powerful. Within just 6 weeks, a cascade of states followed South Carolina's lead. Mississippi seceded on January 9, 1861, followed by Florida on January 10th, and Alabama on January 11th. Georgia, a key state due to its population and industrial capacity, made its momentous decision on January 19th. After a heated debate, Louisiana left the Union on January 26th. And finally, the vast state of Texas voted to secede on February 1st. In a remarkably short period, 7 states had formally declared their withdrawal from the United States of America. These seceding states didn't intend to exist as separate, independent nations for long. The goal was to form a new union, one that would better protect their interests, particularly the institution of slavery. So, on February 4th, 1861, delegates from 6 of the 7 seceded states, Texas delegates, arrived later convened in Montgomery, Alabama. This gathering was a constitutional convention for a new nation. Their task was to quickly establish a functioning government before Lincoln's inauguration in March, hoping to present the world with a fait accompli, a fully formed, sovereign nation. The delegates in Montgomery worked with incredible speed. They wanted to project an image of stability and moderation, not radical revolution. To do this, they decided to model their new constitution largely on the U.S. Constitution, a document they revered. However, they made several key changes that explicitly reflected their reasons for secession. The most significant of these was the unambiguous protection of slavery. The Confederate Constitution explicitly stated that slavery was a protected institution in all its territories and forbade any law that would impair the right to own enslaved people. Other changes were also implemented. The Confederate Constitution gave more power to the individual states, reflecting the deep-seated belief in states' rights. It established a single, 6-year term for the president, hoping to prevent the political maneuvering associated with seeking re-election. It also gave the president a line-item veto, allowing him to reject specific parts of spending bills without vetoing the entire bill. The convention also adopted a provisional constitution to get the government up and running immediately while the permanent version was being finalized and ratified. With a provisional constitution in place, the next step was to choose leaders. The Montgomery Convention needed a president and a vice president to head their new government, which they named the Confederate States of America. The choice for president fell upon Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. Davis was a West Point graduate, a decorated veteran of the Mexican-American War, a former U.S. Senator, and a former Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. He was seen as a moderate secessionist, not one of the fiery fire-eaters who had been most vocal in demanding separation. His extensive military and political experience made him a logical choice to lead the new nation, especially with the prospect of war looming. For vice president, the convention selected Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia. Stephens had actually argued against immediate secession in the Georgia Convention, but he ultimately went with his state. His selection was a strategic move to appeal to more conditional Unionists and project an image of unity among the different factions within the seceded states. On February 18, 1861, Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as the provisional president of the Confederate States of America on the steps of the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery. In his inaugural address, he struck a moderate tone, arguing that secession was a peaceful, legal act of sovereign states, not a rebellion. He expressed a desire for peace with the United States, but also made it clear that the Confederacy would defend its independence if necessary. As the Confederate government was taking shape in Montgomery, the question of federal property within the seceded states became a critical issue. Forts, arsenals, and customs houses belonging to the U.S. government were scattered across the South. In the initial weeks of secession, state forces had seized most of these federal installations without much resistance. However, a few key forts remained in Union hands, most notably Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, and Fort Pickens in Pensacola, Florida. The situation at Fort Sumter was particularly tense. South Carolina viewed the presence of U.S. soldiers in its most important harbor as a direct challenge to its sovereignty. The outgoing U.S. President, James Buchanan, had adopted a cautious and largely ineffective policy. He maintained that secession was illegal, but also believed the federal government had no constitutional authority to force a state to remain in the Union. He had attempted to resupply the fort in January, but the ship was fired upon by South Carolina batteries and turned back. For the moment, Anuncia si Truci existed, with Major Robert Anderson and his small U.S. garrison isolated in the fort, surrounded by newly formed Confederate forces. By the time Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4, 1861, he faced an unprecedented crisis. 7 states had seceded, a rival government had been formed, and a standoff was underway at Fort Sumter. In his own inaugural address, Lincoln tried to walk a fine line. He declared that secession was legally void and that the Union was perpetual. He stated he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed. But he also made it clear that he would hold, occupy, and possess all federal property and collect federal duties. He essentially placed the decision for war in the hands of the Confederacy, concluding his speech with a plea for reconciliation. "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." The formation of the Confederacy was now complete, at least in its initial phase. A new government, with a constitution, a president, and a flag, now existed. This entity claimed sovereignty over a vast territory and a population of millions. The stage was set for a confrontation. The unresolved issue of Fort Sumter would soon become the flashpoint, the spark that would ignite the devastating conflict to come. The experiment in forming a new nation would be tested not by ballots and political debate, but by the fire and steel of war. The calm before the storm was about to end, and the nation would be plunged into the bloodiest chapter of its history. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more chapters in this historical journey. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment in American history, exploring the period between Abraham Lincoln's election and his inauguration. It's a fascinating and incredibly tense time, a true trial by fire that forged a prairie lawyer into the leader the nation desperately needed. So, let's journey back to the winter of 1860. Lincoln has just won the presidency, but the victory feels hollow. The nation isn't celebrating, it's fracturing. Before he even takes the oath of office, the storm of secession begins to gather. South Carolina is the first to leave the Union, and soon, other southern states follow suit, forming the Confederacy. Imagine the weight on Lincoln's shoulders. He's the president-elect of a country that is literally falling apart before his eyes. From his home in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln watched this crisis unfold. He was in a peculiar and powerless position. The current president, James Buchanan, was still in office, and his administration seemed paralyzed, unable or unwilling to take decisive action against the seceding states. Lincoln, on the other hand, had the mandate of the people but no official authority yet. He was bombarded with letters and visitors, each offering advice, warnings, or pleas for compromise. One of the biggest challenges Lincoln faced was forming his cabinet. This wasn't just about filling positions. It was a strategic masterstroke. He decided to build what's famously known as a team of rivals. Instead of surrounding himself with yes-men or loyalists, he deliberately chose his main political competitors for the Republican nomination to serve in his cabinet. Men like William Seward, Salmon Paseo, Chasse, and Edward Bates, all powerful, ambitious figures who thought they were better suited for the presidency than Lincoln himself. Why would he do this? It was a calculated risk. Lincoln believed that, to save the Union, he needed the strongest, most capable minds in the country by his side. Even if they disagreed with him or with each other, he needed their influence. their expertise, and their connections to various factions of the Republican Party and the nation. He was confident in his own ability to manage these strong personalities and channel their ambitions toward the common goal of preserving the nation. It was a sign of incredible self-assurance and political genius. He was building a government that reflected the diverse and often conflicting opinions of the northern states. During this time, Lincoln was also carefully crafting his inaugural address. Every word was weighed, every phrase scrutinized. He had to strike an impossible balance. He needed to be firm in his conviction that secession was illegal and that the Union was perpetual. Yet he also had to offer a hand of reconciliation to the South. He wanted to avoid provoking a war while making it clear that he would not back down from his duty to protect and defend the United States. His message was clear. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. He was appealing to the better angels of our nature, hoping that reason and shared history could still prevail over passion and division. While preparing his speech in his cabinet, Lincoln also had to manage public perception. He was still a relatively unknown figure on the national stage. Many people, especially in the East, saw him as a rough, uncultured backwoodsman from Illinois. They underestimated him, viewing him as unprepared for the monumental task ahead. Lincoln was aware of these perceptions. To counter them, he largely remained silent in public during this period, avoiding off-the-cuff remarks that could be twisted or misinterpreted by the press. His silence was strategic. It made his opponents anxious and his supporters curious. It built anticipation for his inauguration, when he would finally lay out his vision for the country. Then came the long, perilous journey from Springfield to Washington, D.C. in February 1861. This wasn't a celebratory tour. It was a dangerous trip through a divided nation. As his train made its way east, Lincoln made several stops, delivering brief speeches to the crowds that gathered. These speeches were an opportunity for the people to see their new leader, to hear his voice, and to take his measure. He spoke of his commitment to the Union and the Constitution, trying to reassure the public while giving away little of his specific plans. The journey was fraught with danger. There were credible threats of assassination, particularly in Baltimore, a city with strong pro-slavery sentiments. Detectives, including the famous Allan Pinkerton, uncovered a plot to kill Lincoln as he passed through the city. To avoid the danger, Lincoln's itinerary was secretly changed. He was smuggled through Baltimore in the middle of the night, arriving in Washington, D.C. unannounced and ahead of schedule. This clandestine arrival, while necessary for his safety, was unfortunately used by his critics to paint him as a coward. But Lincoln knew that his personal safety was secondary to the survival of the Republic. He had to reach the capital and assume the powers of the presidency. His arrival in Washington marked the end of this strange and stressful interregnum. The months between his election and inauguration were perhaps the most crucial preparation he could have had. He had faced down political rivals, navigated a national crisis from a distance, dodged assassination plots, and articulated a vision for a fractured nation. He learned to balance firmness with conciliation, and to trust his own judgment amidst a sea of conflicting advice. He had been tested not in the halls of power, but in the quiet solitude of his Springfield home and on a tense journey to the capital. The folksy lawyer from the prairie had weathered the storm and was now ready to take the helm. The stage was set for one of the most consequential presidencies in history. Thank you so much for watching. This period truly shows the character and strategic mind of Lincoln before he even stepped into the presidency. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think about Lincoln's team of rivals strategy. See you in the next video. February 11th, 1861. A cold, gray morning in Springfield, Illinois. A crowd is gathered at the Great Western Railroad station, their breath fogging in the chilly air. They're here to see him off their neighbor, their friend, their president-elect, Abraham Lincoln. He stands on the rear platform of the train, a tall, somber figure against the bleak sky. The weight of a nation on the brink of collapse is visible on his face. He begins to speak, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. "My friends," he says, "no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting. To these plays and the kindness of these people, I owe everything." He speaks of leaving for a task greater than that which rested upon Washington. He asks for their prayers and for the assistance of that divine being who can go with him and remain with them and be everywhere for good. With a final, heartfelt farewell, the train lurches forward, beginning one of the most perilous and consequential journeys in American history. The destination, Washington, D.C. The mission, to hold the Union together. The train, a special 4-car convoy, wasn't just a mode of transport. It was a moving stage. For 12 days, it would wind its way through Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. This wasn't a direct route. It was a carefully planned, winding odyssey designed to bring the president-elect to the people. At a time when the nation was fracturing, with 7 states having already seceded, Lincoln knew he needed to be seen. He needed to be heard. He needed to reassure a frightened populace that the government in Washington was not their enemy, but their own. The journey was a test of endurance, a political tour, and a profound act of faith in the American people. The first major stop was Indianapolis. As the train pulled in, a massive crowd roared its welcome. The sheer number of people was staggering. Lincoln, ever the humble statesman, stepped out to address them. He didn't come with fiery rhetoric or grand pronouncements. Instead, his tone was calm, almost conversational. He spoke of the Union not as a mere political arrangement, but as a family bond. He reminded them that the government belonged to them, the people. He posed questions rather than dictating answers, gently guiding his audience to consider the absurdity of secession. "What is the true meaning of coercion?" he asked. "Is it coercing a state if you simply try to hold on to your own property, like a federal fort?" It was a masterful performance. He was planting seeds of thought, encouraging reason over passion, and subtly framing the secessionists as the aggressors. He wasn't a tyrant coming to conquer. He was a leader trying to preserve what they all had built together. From Indianapolis, the journey continued to Cincinnati, Ohio. Here, on the border with the slave state of Kentucky, the tension was palpable. Lincoln, standing on a hotel balcony overlooking a sea of faces, addressed the Kentuckians in the crowd directly. He spoke to them not as adversaries, but as friends, as brethren. He assured them he had no intention of interfering with slavery where it existed. His goal was preservation, not revolution. He famously said, "We mean to treat you as near as we possibly can, as Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson treated you." He was invoking the Founding Fathers, reminding everyone of their shared heritage and the principles that had once united them. He was appealing to their better angels, urging them to look past the current crises and remember the common ground they stood on. It was a message of reconciliation, a hand extended across a deepening divide. The train chugged onward to the state capital, Columbus. Again, a massive crowd, a formal reception at the State House. Here, Lincoln addressed the Ohio legislature. He admitted his own anxieties, his own feeling of inadequacy for the monumental task ahead. This wasn't false modesty. It was genuine humility. "I am but an accidental instrument, temporary, and to serve." But for a limited time, he confessed, by showing his own vulnerability, he made himself more relatable, more human. He wasn't a distant, untouchable figure. He was one of them, grappling with the same fears for the country's future. He stressed that the preservation of the Union was not his burden alone, but a shared responsibility. "It is your business," he told them, "the business of the people of the whole country." He was empowering them, reminding them that the fate of the nation rested in their collective hands. As the journey progressed, a routine developed. At every tomb, every crossing, people gathered. They stood for hours in the snow and freezing rain just to catch a glimpse of the man who held their country's destiny. At whistle stops, Lincoln would appear on the rear platform, offer a few words of thanks and encouragement, and wave to the cheering crowds. Sometimes his wife, Mary, and his sons, Willie and Tad, would appear with him, a portrait of a family weathering the storm together. These brief appearances were crucial. They humanized the presidency and forged a personal connection between Lincoln and the people. He wasn't just a name in a newspaper. He was the tall, kind-faced man who had stopped to speak to them in their own town. The journey wasn't without its dangers. Agent Pinkerton, head of the famous detective agency, had been hired to provide security. His agents were scattered along the route, blending into the crowds, listening for whispers of plots, and they found them. In Baltimore, a city with strong Southern sympathies, Pinkerton uncovered a credible assassination plot. The plan was for conspirators to mob Lincoln during his scheduled transfer between train stations in the city, creating chaos under which an assassin could strike. The threat was real and immediate. Pinkerton and Lincoln's advisors knew they had to act. The original schedule had Lincoln arriving in Baltimore in the middle of the day, a prime time for a public spectacle and a potential attack. The plan had to change, and it had to change in secret. After a rousing speech in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where he spoke emotionally at a flag-raising ceremony at the state capitol, the public part of the journey came to an abrupt end. Under the cover of darkness, Lincoln's public persona vanished. He swapped his signature tall hat and overcoat for a soft felt hat and a short cloak. Accompanied only by Pinkerton and his trusted friend, Ward Hill Lamon, Lincoln slipped away from his hotel. The telegraph lines out of Harrisburg were cut to prevent any word of the change of plans from leaking out. He boarded a secret, single-car train back to Philadelphia. The President-elect of the United States was now traveling incognito, a fugitive in his own country. In Philadelphia, they waited for the scheduled midnight train to Washington. Lincoln and Lamon boarded a sleeping car, pretending to be an invalid, and his brother. The tension must have been unbearable. Every stop, every new passenger, was a potential threat. As the train rumbled through the night, it passed through Baltimore, the heart of the conspiracy. Lincoln lay in his berth, awake and alert, while the train moved from the Calvert Street station to the Camden Street station, the very point where the attack was supposed to happen. But in the dead of night, the city was quiet. Tep plotters expecting their target to arrive in the afternoon were nowhere to be seen. The train moved on, undetected. The trap had been sprung, but the prey had already escaped. At 6 o'clock in the morning on February 23rd, the train finally pulled into the Washington, D.C. station. Abraham Lincoln, disguised and exhausted, stepped onto the platform a head-made Italiano. The 12th day, 1,900-mile journey was over. It had been a whirlwind of speeches, handshakes, and cheering crowds, culminating in a secret, nerve-wracking dash through the night. This inaugural journey was a microcosm of the presidency that would follow, a public effort to unite a divided people, shadowed by the constant threat of violence and dissolution. Lincoln had come to Washington not as a conqueror, but as a peacemaker. He had listened, he had reassured, and he had reminded Americans of the bonds that held them together. He had run the gauntlet and arrived safely, ready to face the storm that was about to break. The stage was now set for his inauguration, and for the struggle to save the soul of America. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe for more history brought to life. Have you ever felt that intense, gut-wrenching dread before a difficult conversation? That feeling where you'd rather do almost anything else than face a conflict? Now, imagine that feeling, but on a national scale. Imagine an entire country holding its breath, teetering on the brink of a catastrophic family feud. That's where America found itself in the mid-19th century. Today, we're diving into a pivotal moment in history, a time when a powerful voice rose above the growing storm, pleading for unity and reminding a divided nation of the deep, unbreakable bonds that held them together. This isn't just a story about politics. It's a story about human nature, about our deep-seated desire to avoid conflict, and the desperate hope that love and shared history can conquer even the most profound disagreements. Let's set the scene. The air is thick with tension. North and South are drifting further apart, their values and economies seemingly at odds. The issue of slavery has become a deep, festering wound that threatens to tear the nation in two. It's like a family argument that has spiraled out of control, where whispers have turned to shouts and long-held resentments are boiling over. In every town square, in every newspaper, the debate rages. Can this union, this grand experiment in democracy, actually survive? Or is it destined to shatter into pieces? The fear is palpable. People are scared. They see the storm clouds gathering, and they know that the coming conflict won't be a distant battle fought by soldiers. It will pit neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. Amidst this rising tide of hostility, there were voices of reason. Leaders who understood the catastrophic cost of division. They weren't naive. They saw the deep-seated problems, but they also saw something else. A shared heritage. They looked at the flag and didn't just see stars and stripes. They saw the blood, sweat, and tears of a revolution fought together. They heard the national anthem and remembered a time when we the people meant everyone, united against a common foe. Their plea was simple, yet profound. Do not break this bond. It was a desperate cry from the heart of a nation on the verge of self. Think about the power of that shared bond. It's the 4th of July picnics, the stories of the founding fathers passed down through generations, the collective pride in building something new and extraordinary in the world. These leaders were essentially asking Americans to look past their anger and remember who they were. They were saying, look at all we've built together. Look at the sacrifices made. Are we really going to throw it all away? It's a question that resonates even today, isn't it? The desire to preserve unity, to find common ground, is a powerful human instinct. It's the glue that holds families, communities, and nations together. This appeal wasn't just about nostalgia. It was a pragmatic warning. The leaders who urged caution understood that a house divided against itself cannot stand. They foresaw the horrific bloodshed, the economic ruin, and the deep, lasting scars that a civil war would leave. They were pleading with their fellow citizens to step back from the brink, to choose the difficult path of compromise over the seemingly easy release of conflict. They reminded people that they were not enemies, but friends. They may have been strained, they may have been angry, but they were still part of the same American family. The bonds of affection, though stretched, must not be broken. This message was a call to our better angels. It was an appeal to empathy, to the ability to see the humanity in those with whom we disagree. The argument was that the mystic chords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart, would yet swell the chorus of the Union when touched again by the better angels of our nature. It's a beautifully poetic way of saying that our shared history, our collective memory, has a sacred power. It connects us in ways that political disagreements cannot easily sever. If we could just quiet the noise and listen, we might hear that shared music once again. This wasn't about ignoring the problems. The issue of slavery was a moral cancer that had to be addressed, but the plea was to handle this crisis as a family, not as mortal enemies. It was a call for dialogue, for understanding, and for a solution that wouldn't require the ultimate sacrifice of the nation itself. It was a recognition that once the bond is broken, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to piece it back together. The scars of such a break would last for generations, creating a legacy of bitterness and resentment. They were trying to save America from itself. The tragedy, of course, is that this plea ultimately went unheeded. The storm did break, and the Civil War became the bloodiest conflict in American history. But the power of that message, the desperate desire to avoid the conflict and preserve the Union, remains a vital part of the American story. It teaches us a crucial lesson, that unity is fragile, that it requires constant effort and a willingness to listen, and that the bonds that connect us are precious and worth fighting to preserve. It's a reminder that even in our darkest moments of division, there is always a shared story, a common thread that ties us together. So as we look back at this moment, it's more than just a history lesson. It's a mirror reflecting our own times. We live in an age of deep divisions, where it's easy to see those on the other side as the enemy. But the voices from the past call out to us, urging us not to break our shared bond. They remind us that we are all part of a larger story, a story that is still being written, and we have the power to choose whether the next chapter is one of conflict and division, or one of reconciliation and a renewed sense of shared purpose. The desire to avoid conflict is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of wisdom. It's the recognition that what unites us is ultimately far more important than what divides us. And as we navigate the challenges of our own time, we would do well to remember that plea from a nation on the brink. Let us not be enemies, but friends. Let us not break the sacred bonds that tie us together. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as compelling as I do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter in this incredible journey through history. See you next time. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into American history. Today, we re-exploring one of the most tense and pivotal periods in the nation. This past, the early months of 1861. This was a time when the United States stood precariously on the brink of collapse, a nation on the edge. The year began with a heavy cloud of uncertainty hanging over the country. Following the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860, 7 states from the deep South, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had already seceded from the Union. They saw Lincoln's victory, a Republican triumph on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery as a direct threat to their way of life and their entire economic and social structure. The air was thick with tension, a mixture of defiance, fear, and a desperate hope that somehow the Union could be preserved without bloodshed. In Washington, D.C., the atmosphere was especially grim. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, seemed paralyzed by the crisis. He believed secession was illegal, but also felt the federal government had no constitutional power to force the states to remain. His inaction created a dangerous power vacuum in the critical months between Lincoln's election and his inauguration in March. During this secession winter, radical voices on both sides grew louder, drowning out the moderates who were frantically trying to find a compromise. The nation was holding its breath, waiting to see what the new president would do. In February 1861, representatives from the seceded states met in Montgomery, Alabama. There, they formed a new government, the Confederate States of America. They drafted their own constitution, which explicitly protected the institution of slavery, and elected Jefferson Davis, a former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, as their provisional president. This act was a direct challenge to the authority of the United States. They weren't just threatening to leave, they had created a rival nation. They began seizing federal property within their borders, forts, arsenals, and custom houses, testing the resolve of a fractured federal government. Meanwhile, back in Washington, desperate attempts at compromise were underway. The most notable of these was the Crittenden Compromise, proposed by Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky. This was a package of constitutional amendments designed to appease the South. Its central proposal was to extend the old Missouri Compromise line of 3,630 all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Slavery would be prohibited in all territories north of this line, but it would be given federal protection in all territories south of it. Both existing and those hereafter acquired, it was a last-ditch effort to turn back the clock and find a middle ground. Many in the border states, and even some northern Democrats, supported it, hoping it could avert war. But for the newly ascendant Republican Party, and for President-elect Lincoln, this was a line they could not cross. The core principle of their party was the prevention of slavery's expansion. To agree to the Crittenden Compromise would be to betray the very platform they had just won the election on. Lincoln, still in Springfield, Illinois, made his position clear in private letters to his Republican colleagues in Congress. He was firm, entertained no proposition for a compromise in regard to the extension of slavery. He wrote, "The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter." He believed that any concession on this point would only embolden the secessionists and lead to future demands for more slave territory, making a future conflict inevitable. With Lincoln's opposition, the compromise failed in Congress. The last best hope for a peaceful legislative solution was gone. On March 4, 1861, Abraham Lincoln stood on the east portico of the Capitol to deliver his first inaugural address. The nation listened with bated breath. What would he say? Would he declare war? Would he let the South go in peace? Lincoln's speech was a masterpiece of political rhetoric, a carefully crafted appeal for unity and reason. He began by reassuring the Southern states. He declared he had no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. He believed he had no lawful right to do so, and he had no inclination to do so. His goal was not to abolish slavery where it was already established, but to preserve the Union. He argued that the Union was perpetual, that secession was legally void. The acts of violence within any state against the authority of the United States were, in his view, insurrectionary or revolutionary. According to circumstances, He tried to walk a fine line. He would not be the aggressor, but he would also not surrender federal authority. He stated his intention to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government, and to collect the duties and imposts. This was a clear, though calmly stated, warning. He would not abandon federal forts like Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, but the most powerful part of his address was its closing appeal. Lincoln spoke directly to the people of the South, not as enemies, but as fellow countrymen. "We are not enemies, but friends," he pleaded. "We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." It was a poetic and deeply moving plea for peace and reconciliation. He was placing the decision for war or peace squarely in the hands of the "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war," he concluded. "The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors." Lincoln's words were powerful, but the time for words was rapidly running out. The immediate crisis centered on a handful of federal forts still holding out in the seceded states. The most critical of these was Fort Sumter, located in the middle of Charleston Harbor, the very heart of the secessionist movement in South Carolina. The small Union garrison, commanded by Major Robert Anderson, was running desperately low on food and supplies. For Lincoln, Fort Sumter became the ultimate test of his policy. To abandon it would be a sign of weakness, an effective recognition of the Confederacy, but to reinforce it with warships and troops would be seen as an act of aggression, likely sparking the conflict he so desperately wanted to avoid. He was caught in an impossible situation. Jefferson Davis and the Confederate government faced their own dilemma. They could not tolerate a foreign fort in one of their most important harbors. It was a symbol of federal authority that undermined their claim to sovereignty. After much deliberation, Lincoln devised a brilliant and carefully calculated plan. He decided he would send only provisions, food, and medicine to the beleaguered soldiers at Fort Sumter. He would not send troops or ammunition, at least not initially. And crucially, he informed the governor of South Carolina of his intentions beforehand. This move was a political matter. It shifted the responsibility for starting a war directly onto Jefferson Davis. If Confederate forces fired on unarmed ships bringing food to hungry men, the South would be seen as the clear aggressor in the eyes of the North and the world. If they allowed the supplies to pass, the Union flag would continue to fly over Charleston Harbor, a humiliating symbol of their failure to establish complete independence. Davis and his cabinet in Montgomery felt they had no choice. They could not back down. They decided to demand the fort's surrender before the supply mission could arrive. On April 10, 1861, the Confederate government authorized General P.G.T. Beauregard, the commander of forces in Charleston, to demand the evacuation of Fort Sumter, and if refused, to reduce it. At 4:30 a.m., on the morning of April 12, 1861, after Major Anderson politely refused the demand, Confederate cannons ringing Charleston Harbor opened fire on the fort. The nation on the edge had finally tumbled into the abyss. The bombardment lasted for 34 hours. Miraculously, no one was killed in the exchange of fire. But the fort was battered, its fires raging, and Anderson had no choice but to surrender. The attack on Fort Sumter was the spark that ignited the flame. In the North, Lincoln's call for unity, once just words, now had the power of a rallying cry. The sight of the American flag being fired upon electrified the public. The debate was over. The time for compromise had passed. The attack united a previously divided North behind the cause of preserving the Union. On April 15th, President Lincoln issued a proclamation calling for 75,000 volunteer soldiers from the loyal states to put down the rebellion. The response was overwhelming. In cities and towns across the North, recruiting offices were flooded with enthusiastic young men eager to defend the flag. The war was on. Lincoln's call for troops had an immediate and predictable effect on the wavering states of the Upper South. Faced with the choice of fighting against their fellow Southerners or joining them, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina all voted to secede and join the Confederacy. The lines were now drawn. The nation was formally and tragically split in two. The tense months of waiting and watching, of failed compromises and desperate appeals, were over. The struggle for the very soul of America had begun, and it would be decided not in legislative halls, but on the battlefield. Thank you so much for watching. This period is a powerful reminder of how fragile a nation can be and how quickly words can give way to action. If you found this video interesting, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel for more chapters in this incredible story. We'll see you next time.
The election of 1860 wasn't just another presidential race. It was the spark that ignited a firestorm, a moment that would forever alter the course of American history. When Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, it was a seismic shock to the system. The nation, already teetering on the brink, finally fractured. The deep, festering wounds of slavery, sectionalism, and states' rights were torn wide open. The Southern states saw Lincoln's victory not just as a political defeat, but as an existential threat to their way of life, an institution they believed was their economic and social bedrock. The die was cast. Before Lincoln even took the oath of office, the dominoes of secession began to fall, starting with South Carolina. One by one, states declared their departure from the Union, convinced that their rights and their future could no longer be protected within it. The idea of a peaceful transfer of power, the very cornerstone of the American experiment, shattered. The stage was set for the Civil War, the bloodiest and most defining conflict in the nation's history. The election of 1860 was the point of no return. It wasn't just about who would occupy the White House. It was a referendum on the very soul of America. Would it be a nation half slave and half free? Or would it finally begin the painful, arduous journey toward fulfilling the promise of its founding creed that all men are created equal? Lincoln's victory ensured that this question would be answered. Not with compromise or negotiation, but with cannon fire and bloodshed on the fields of battle. This election marked the end of an era of fragile compromises and the beginning of a brutal, transformative struggle for the nation's identity. From the ashes of this conflict, a new America would emerge. Forged in the crucible of war and guided by the steady hand of the man whose election started it all, Abraham Lincoln. His leadership during these tumultuous years was nothing short of extraordinary. He was more than just a president. He became the moral compass of a nation at war with itself. Lincoln's primary goal, at first, was to preserve the Union. He argued passionately that the nation was indivisible, a perpetual contract that no state could unilaterally break. His early rhetoric focused on reunification, on bringing the wayward Southern states back into the fold. But as the war dragged on, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives, Lincoln's purpose evolved. The conflict became something much deeper, a struggle for human freedom. The turning point was the Emancipation Proclamation. While it didn't free all enslaved people overnight, it was a monumental declaration. It transformed the war from a political dispute into a moral crusade against slavery. It sent a powerful message to the world and to the soldiers fighting on the front lines. This was now a war to end the institution that had plagued the nation since its birth. Lincoln's vision was one of a new birth of freedom, a concept he so eloquently articulated in the Gettysburg Address. He wasn't just trying to put the country back together as it was. He was aiming to rebuild it on a stronger, more just foundation. He envisioned a nation where the promises of the Declaration of Independence applied to everyone, not just a select few, through his powerful words and unwavering resolve. Lincoln guided the Union through its darkest hours, redefining the purpose of the war and, in doing so, redefining the very meaning of America itself. The legacy of the 1860 election and Lincoln's subsequent presidency resonates to this day. It's a legacy written in blood, sacrifice, and ultimately, rebirth. The Civil War settled, once and for all, the questions of secession and slavery that had haunted the nation for decades. The supremacy of the federal government was established, and the idea that a state could simply leave the Union was put to rest. More profoundly, the war led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, often called the Reconstruction Amendments. These amendments abolished slavery, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law, and gave African American men the right to vote. They were a radical, revolutionary redefinition of American freedom and citizenship. While the road to true equality would be long and fraught with immense challenges, these amendments laid the legal groundwork for the civil rights movements that would follow a century later. Lincoln's vision of a government of the people, by the people, for the people became a rallying cry for future generations, striving to create a more perfect union. The election of 1860, therefore, was not just a political event. It was the catalyst for a second American Revolution. It forced the nation to confront its original sin and begin the painful ongoing process of living up to its highest ideals. Lincoln's leadership ensured that the nation would not perish from the earth, but would be reborn, dedicated to the proposition that liberty and justice are for all. The America we live in today, with all its complexities and ongoing struggles for equality, was fundamentally shaped by the outcome of that single election and the transformative years of war and Reconstruction that followed. The echoes of 1860 are still with us, reminding us of the fragility of democracy and the enduring power of the fight for freedom. Thanks for watching, and if you found this chapter insightful, please like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into history.
Welcome back to our quiet corner of history. Let's settle in and get comfortable for our final chapter tonight. Let the day's worries drift away. Take a deep, slow breath in, and as you exhale, feel your body relax, your muscles soften, and your mind begin to clear. Let the gentle rhythm of your breathing guide you into a state of peace and tranquility. We've journeyed through a time of great division, a nation on the brink of profound change. We've seen the threads of disagreement tighten, pulling the country in different directions. And at the heart of this tension, we met a man named Abraham Lincoln, whose path to the presidency was anything but simple. As we reflect on his journey, think about the immense pressure of that time. The air was thick with uncertainty, with whispers of conflict and the heavy weight of a nation's future. For Lincoln, and for everyone living through those moments, each day must have felt like navigating a stormy sea. The challenges were monumental, the stakes higher than ever before. It's easy for us, looking back through the lens of history, to see the outcome. But for him, It was an unfolding story, filled with fear, hope, and the unknown. They didn't know if the storm would pass, or if it would break the ship of state apart. Isn't it often like that in our own lives? We face moments that feel overwhelming, challenges that seem insurmountable. We stand at a crossroads, unsure of which path to take, and the future feels like a closed book. In these moments of personal struggle, it can be hard to see the purpose or the potential for growth. We might feel lost, just as many Americans felt lost in the years leading up to 1860. Yet, it is precisely in these moments of difficulty, these periods of intense pressure, that the seeds of our most important transformations are often sown. Just as a diamond is formed under immense pressure, our character is often forged in the fires of adversity. Think of a time in your own life when you faced a significant challenge. Perhaps it was a difficult decision, a personal setback, or a period of uncertainty. At the time, it probably felt like a heavy burden. But looking back now, can you see how that experience shaped you? Maybe it taught you resilience, patience, or a new kind of strength you didn't know you possessed. Maybe it redirected your path in a way you never expected, leading you to a better place, a deeper understanding of yourself, or a newfound appreciation for the quiet moments of peace that followed. These challenging times, as uncomfortable as they are often the catalysts for our most meaningful growth. They are the crucibles where we discover who we truly are. The election of Abraham Lincoln was one such moment for a nation. It was the culmination of years of debate, of deeply held beliefs clashing, of a country struggling with its own identity and its founding principles. The division was so deep that the election itself felt like a point of no return. It wasn't just a political event, it was a profound historical pivot. For many, his victory was a beacon of hope, a signal that the nation might finally confront the moral crisis of slavery. For others, it was a confirmation of their deepest fears, a sign that the union they knew was about to shatter. The emotions were raw, powerful, and deeply personal. And in that moment of supreme challenge, a new chapter began. It wasn't an easy chapter. In fact, it was the beginning of one of the most difficult and painful periods in American history. The storm did not pass. It broke with all its fury. But through that storm, change was forged. The election of Lincoln didn't magically solve the nation's problems. Instead, it set the stage for the difficult, necessary work that had to be done. It marked the beginning of a transformation, a painful rebirth that would ultimately redefine the meaning of freedom and union. It showed that even in the darkest of nights, a new dawn is possible, even if it's preceded by a tempest. This is a powerful lesson for us as we drift off to sleep. The challenges we face, both big and small, are not just obstacles. They are opportunities. They are the universe's way of asking us to grow, to change, to become more than we were before. When we feel tested, it's a sign that we are on the verge of an important transition. Just like the nation in 1860, we stand at the threshold of a new chapter. And while the path ahead may be uncertain, we can trust that the struggle itself is part of the journey toward something new and meaningful. We don't need to have all the answers right now. We just need to have faith in our own resilience, in our ability to navigate the storm. As you lie here, wrapped in the quiet of the night, allow yourself to release any lingering struggles from your day. See them not as burdens, but as stepping stones. Acknowledge the strength it took to face them. Each challenge you meet is a testament to your own endurance. You are navigating your own history, writing your own story of growth and transformation. Lincoln's election was a single moment, a turning point that unleashed a wave of change. It reminds us that history isn't just a collection of dates and events. It's a story of human struggle, resilience, and the perpetual hope for a better future. It is a story of how the most difficult times can lead to the most profound and necessary changes. Let this thought be a source of comfort tonight. Whatever you are navigating in your life, know that it is part of your unique story. These moments of challenge are not the end of the road. They are the start of a powerful new chapter. You have the strength within you to face what comes, to learn from it, and to emerge stronger on the other side. The story of 1860 is a reminder that even when things seem to be falling apart, they may actually be falling into place, paving the way for a new beginning. Now, let your mind drift. Let go of all the thinking and analyzing. Just rest. Let the gentle rhythm of your breath be your anchor. Feel the weight of your body sinking comfortably into your bed. The story is told for tonight. The lessons are learned. All that is left is to surrender to the peace of this moment, to the restorative promise of sleep. Know that you are capable, you are resilient, and you are ready for the new chapter that awaits you when you wake. Sleep well, and dream of the strength you hold within. Thank you for joining me on this journey. I hope you'll join me again soon for another story. Good night.